she didn't scream. That's what nobody talks about. When Alpha King Draven Kalor stood before 10,000 witnesses and cut the soul bond like it was a trade contract, Lady Soralia Vane didn't make a single sound. She just stood there while the silver light died on her wrist, and that silence scared the entire court more than any blade ever could. Because the most dangerous thing in any empire isn't the woman who breaks, it's the one who doesn't. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The night the empire changed forever, it smelled like burning cedar and cold ambition. Soralia had noticed that about ceremonial fires, they always chose cedar. Something about purification, about sanctifying the covenant between bonded souls. For 3 years, she had stood beside those flames during Kalor court ritual, and for 3 years, the smoke had curled around her shoulders like something that almost resembled belonging. She knew better now. Belonging inside palace walls was never free. It was leased, with terms written in ink invisible to the eye, until the moment the creditor arrived to collect. She was dressed in ivory tonight. Someone had chosen that deliberately, the ceremonial color of soul-bonding declarations, the color brides wore in the old Eastern traditions when they stepped forward to receive their place beside a sovereign. Her attendants had braided her dark hair with silver thread and pinned a crown of white ash blossoms above her ears. She had stood still while they worked, watching her own reflection in the obsidian mirror above her dressing table, thinking how strange it was that preparation for one kind of moment could look identical to preparation for its opposite. The Grand Hall of Sovereigns held capacity for 4,000 bodies on its primary floor and could accommodate nearly twice that in the elevated balconies that ringed the chamber's upper circumference. Tonight, it held all of them. Council lords occupied the tiered seats of governance along the eastern wall, their ceremonial chains of office glinting beneath suspended silver chandeliers that burned with living flame, a sorcery of the old empire, impossible to replicate, impossible to extinguish by ordinary means. The nobility of 7 provincial houses filled the balconies with their whispers and their calculated expressions. Common citizens, permitted entry by lottery for state occasions, pressed against the far gallery rails with genuine wonder on their faces, unbothered by the performance of dignity that the upper tiers practiced so exhaustively. Soralia stood on the throne dais. She could feel every set of eyes in that hall without meeting any of them. 3 years of court life had developed in her a particular sensitivity to collective attention, the way it pressed against skin, the way it had weight and texture, the way it shifted when the room's emotional temperature changed. Right now, the attention was anticipatory, warm. The crowd expected covenant sealing. They expected the moment when the Alpha King extended his hand and completed what the soul bond had begun, the formal integration that would bind their fates through empire law as well as through whatever mysterious ancient mechanism had inscribed matching marks upon their wrists at the moment of first recognition. Draven stood 3 feet from her. He was built for rooms like this. She had always understood that about him. His physical presence was not incidental to his power. It was foundational to it. Broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of bone structure that portrait painters reproduced for generations. His ceremonial armor was black with silver edging. The Kalor wolf sigil worked in raised relief across his chest. He held himself the way walls hold themselves, absolutely without question. The court did not simply look at him. They oriented toward him the way plants orient toward light, not through choice, but through something more fundamental than choice. She had loved him, or something close enough to love that the difference had felt academic. Had. The past tense arrived in her chest without violence. That was the strangest part. She had expected, if this moment ever came, that it would feel like falling. Instead, it felt like finally understanding a sentence she had been reading incorrectly for years. The words were the same. The meaning was entirely different. Draven turned to face her, and she saw it in his jaw before he spoke. The slight tightening at the hinges, the deliberate steadying of breath. She had cataloged his tells across 1,000 hours in these rooms and corridors, and she recognized this one without difficulty. He was not nervous. He was prepared. Soralia. His voice carried without effort to every corner of the hall, not raised, not strained, perfectly calibrated for a room of 8,000 witnesses. There are words I must speak before this court. The anticipatory warmth in the crowd's attention shifted, fractionally, like a change in wind direction that only those already paying attention would notice. She looked at him directly, said nothing. The Kaelor line requires more than bond covenant to survive what comes. He paused. Military alliance with the Thorn bloodline represents a necessity I cannot set aside. Lady Varessa Thorn stands prepared to formalize that union. The shift in the room's attention became violent. Not the crowd. Not yet. The council lords moved first. She saw Lord Carrick's of the Eastern Territories rise half out of his chair, face going through several colors in rapid succession. Two ministers grabbed each other's arms. The head of the Chamber of Sealed Bonds, an elderly woman named Councillor Peth, who had overseen more covenants than any living official, placed both hands flat on the rail before her as though bracing for impact. Draven did not look at any of them. In the name of Kaelor sovereignty and imperial continuity, I invoke the severance rite. Then the silver light on her wrist began to die. It didn't hurt. She had always imagined it would hurt. She had heard accounts of severance from bonded pairs where the physical agony was described in terms of amputation, of something essential being removed without anesthesia. But what she felt was closer to what she imagined it felt like to have a sound slowly removed from a room. Not pain, absence. The quiet where something had been. The soul mark on the inside of her left wrist. The delicate tracing of silver lines that had appeared on her skin 3 years ago in the same instant it appeared on Draven's, collapsed into smoke. Literally became smoke. The silver light drew inward on itself like a tide retreating, compressed to a point, and then dispersed in a thin curl of silver gray that rose toward the chandeliers and was gone. The crowd made a sound unlike anything she had ever heard in 4 years of court attendance. It was not quite a gasp, and not quite a scream, and not quite silence. It was all three of those things trying to occupy the same moment simultaneously, which produced something that had no name in any language she knew. She looked at her wrist. Bare skin. The faintest shadow of what had been, already fading. She looked up, and did not cry. Not because she was suppressing anything, not because she was performing composure for the audience that was now devouring her with every sense they possessed, but because somewhere in the 3 seconds between Draven's first sentence and the extinction of the soul mark, something inside her had made a decision so fundamental that it registered not as thought, but as physical sensation, a settling, like ground that has been shaking, finally going still. She was not going to give this room her grief. Not because they didn't deserve to witness it, not because pride demanded otherwise, but because her grief was hers. It was the last thing in that hall that belonged entirely to her, and she was not going to surrender it to a crowd that would use it as entertainment and call the consumption empathy. Lord Carrick's had made it to his feet completely now. His voice hit the hall like a thrown weapon. This is an outrage. The sealed chamber cannot recognize severance right without formal petition, without a 30-day deliberation period, without, I'm aware of the procedural requirements. Draven's tone was patient with him the way a stone wall is patient with rain. The petition was filed 6 weeks ago. The deliberation period concluded at midnight. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Soraya had ever heard. 6 weeks. He had filed the petition 6 weeks ago. He had walked beside her in these halls for 6 weeks knowing. He had sat across from her at the council table and listened to her analysis of the border situation and nodded at her reasoning and passed her the wine carafe when her glass was empty and known. She did not look away from him. He met her eyes and, to his credit, or perhaps to his damnation, he did not look away either. You filed it 6 weeks ago, she said. Her voice came out level. She was mildly surprised by that. Yes. And you didn't say anything? No. Why? Something moved behind his eyes. She watched it carefully. It was not shame exactly. It was something closer to the expression a general wore when acknowledging a tactically necessary choice that had personal cost. I needed the ceremony to proceed without disruption, he said. If you had known in advance, I would have disrupted it. Yes. She almost laughed. The honesty was so architectural, so perfectly load-bearing in its coldness. Of course. He needed her in that room in ivory and silver thread and ash blossoms, standing on the dais in position, present and prepared for covenant, because the ceremony required her presence, and she would not have come willingly to be publicly discarded. So he had not told her, and she had walked into it dressed for the opposite. You needed me in position, she said. It was necessary. For the procedure to be valid. Yes. She nodded once, slowly, as if receiving information she was filing away for later use, which was exactly what she was doing. The council chamber was in open chaos now. Two lords were shouting simultaneously at the sealed chamber minister, who was attempting to read from a procedural scroll with shaking hands. Noble factions in the balconies had broken into visible argument. She could see it in the body language, the sharp gestures, the way certain lords were already moving toward the exits with the particular stride of men who needed to reach their communication lines before anyone else did. A provincial house could restructure 3 alliances in the time it took a rumor to circulate once through the palace. Every lord in that balcony understood that tonight had just become a new board, and the pieces were moving. Soralia understood it too. She had spent 3 years learning this court. She had sat in more advisory sessions than any consort in Kalar history, had memorized the particular fault lines between houses, had understood which alliances were load-bearing and which were decorative. It had been her edge, her value offering beyond what the soul bond provided. She had been useful, genuinely, substantively, strategically useful, and Draven had still chosen the army Veresathorn came with. She found she could not even be surprised by the calculation. She recognized it. She might have made the same calculation herself if their positions had been reversed, and Kalor's eastern border were bleeding out one garrison at a time, and the only sufficient military force in range required a marriage contract to acquire. She understood it. She simply would not forgive it. Those were 2 different things, and she was old enough now to know the difference. Lord Carrix! Draven turned toward the council's most vocal objector with the particular authority of a man who has already decided that the room's displeasure is a weather condition he intends to outlast. The procedures were followed. Your objection is noted and will be entered into council record. I would ask that you... The bronze doors came off their hinges. Not explosively, not violently. They opened, but they opened the way a cliff face opens when something behind it has decided to move, with the kind of force that makes the act of opening itself feel like an understatement. Both massive doors swung inward on the same breath of northern wind, and that wind was sharp and cold and smelled of iron and distance and something older than either. The hall went silent, not quiet, silent. The particular silence of 8,000 people deciding simultaneously not to breathe. He came through the doors without herald, without escort, without the procession of banners and advance ministers that protocol demanded for any sovereign entering foreign imperial territory. He came alone, and the absence of ceremony around him did not diminish him. It magnified him. Because ceremony existed to make powerful men legible, to provide framework and context, to allow observers to know how to categorize what they were seeing. Without it, he was uncontainable. Alpha Emperor Zevran Morvain was not the largest man Soralia had ever seen, but he was the most present. There was a quality to his existence in a room that she could not immediately name, something about the way space organized itself around him, the way eyes tracked him not from training or obligation, but from something more instinctive and less voluntary. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older. His features were hard in the way that things become hard through exposure rather than through nature, weathered rather than carved, shaped by cold and wind, and the specific exhaustion of a man who had built an empire through personal force rather than inherited structure. He wore no ceremonial armor. He wore northern riding clothes, heavy wool, dark leather, the kind of clothes that showed up in a hall like this and immediately made the hall's ceremonial finery look like it was performing a role rather than simply being real. His eyes found Soralia. She felt the moment they did. Not like the soul bond silver warmth. That was gone, and she would not pretend otherwise. This was different. This was the sensation of being assessed by something that did not automatically assume her irrelevance, and after the past 20 minutes, she registered the distinction with a clarity that was almost physical. He looked at her the way a cartographer looks at unmapped territory. Not possession, recognition. Morvain. Draven's voice had changed, not in volume, in texture. There was something at its edges that was not quite uncertainty and not quite alarm, but existed in the territory between them. This is a sovereign internal proceeding. Zevran's voice was quieter than Draven's and carried farther. Yes, I can see what it is. He walked forward. No one stopped him. There were Kalor guards stationed at 6 points along the hall's perimeter, and not one of them moved to intercept. which told Soralia something significant about the calculations being made in real time about the comparative cost of escalating versus observing. Zevran stopped at the edge of the throne dais. He looked at the bare skin of Soralia's wrist. He looked at the thin curl of dissipating silver smoke still tracing its way toward the chandeliers. He looked at the council in their chaos, and the nobles in their political frenzy, and the citizens in their stunned gallery. Then he looked at Draven with an expression so controlled it constituted a kind of weaponized neutrality. "You invoked severance before the full court," Zevran said, "without warning. The petition was legally filed. I didn't ask about the legality." A pause. "I asked about the before the full court without warning." Draven's jaw tightened. "What occurs within Kaelor sovereignty is not a subject open to—" "I'm not opening a subject." Zevran's voice had not risen by a fraction. It remained exactly where it had been, in the register of a man who did not need volume to indicate seriousness. "I'm observing what I see. You're welcome to proceed. I'll watch. Your presence here is irregular. My presence everywhere is irregular. That's never stopped me." Lord Carrick's had abandoned his council scroll entirely and was simply staring. Several balcony lords had stopped their movement toward the exits. The collective attention of the room, which had been spinning between multiple focal points since the doors opened, settled. Two apex rulers on the same dais. One broken bond. An empire holding its breath. Soralia watched Zevran watching Draven, and in the space of that observation she ran through every piece of strategic information she had filed over 3 years about the Northern Emperor. His expansion campaigns had been documented extensively. 4 territorial acquisitions in 7 years, each one preceded by a period of apparent diplomatic engagement that proved in retrospect to have been intelligence gathering rather than negotiation. He was not reckless. He did not move until he understood the terrain completely, and by the time he moved, his opponents had usually already made their critical errors. He was here. He had been here for this. She did not know yet what that meant. She was not naive enough to assume benevolence, but she was too pragmatic to dismiss the fact of his presence as irrelevant. "Soralia remains under the protection of House Kaelor during this transitional," Draven began. "She is not territory." The 5 words landed in the hall with the specificity of a blade finding an exact point between ribs. Not because they were loud, because they were true, and truth spoken directly in rooms built on euphemism tends to reverberate. Draven went very still. "I did not suggest— You invoke territorial protection over a person, as though her status defaulted to an asset of the house upon severance, rather than to—" Zevran's eyes moved briefly to Soralia and held there. "Herself." Soralia's spine straightened by approximately 1 degree. She was not sure Zevran noticed. She was not sure it mattered whether he did. "You are not familiar with Kaelor law," Draven said. "I've been studying it for 2 years. Zevran returned his gaze to Draven without urgency. "The protectorate clause you're referencing was written to prevent a bonded consort from being claimed by rival houses immediately following dissolution. It was not written to restrict her movement at the discretion of the house that dissolved the bond. There is a legal distinction there that I imagine your sealed chamber minister is currently trying to locate in that scroll." He glanced toward Counselor Peth. Counselor Peth was, in fact, reading her scroll with the expression of a woman who had just found an uncomfortable annotation. Soralia thought, he really has been studying for 2 years. She thought, why? She thought, don't answer that yet. You don't have enough information. What is it you want here, Morvain? Draven's patience had not broken, but it had developed visible strain at its edges, the way ice develops visible strain before fracture. You arrived without invitation. You interrupted a public proceeding, Zevran said, in a hall full of witnesses, in territory that borders 2 trade corridors I have formal agreements with. The proceeding is not private because you chose to conduct it publicly. Those are consequences of your own design. The logic was airtight, and Draven knew it. She could see him processing the cage he had constructed for himself. He had staged the severance publicly for maximum political effect, to demonstrate sovereign authority, to perform decisiveness before the court, to make the moment irrevocable. The irrevocability had been the point, and now that irrevocability applied equally to everything that followed. You're attempting to maneuver within a Kaelor proceeding, Draven said. I'm standing in a room. Zevran spread one hand slightly, indicating his own inaction. I haven't touched anything. I haven't commanded anyone. I'm standing here observing a public proceeding and occasionally noting relevant legal details. A pause. Is that a problem? Your intent is not subtle. My intent is not concealed, no. Concealing things is more your area tonight. That landed differently. The council heard it. The balconies heard it. Even the citizens in the gallery heard something shift in the chamber's temperature that they didn't have the political vocabulary to name, but could feel in their skin. Soralia heard it very clearly. She had thought, in those first few minutes on the dais before the doors opened, that her most important task tonight was surviving the moment with enough dignity intact to function tomorrow. That was still true, but the parameters of what tomorrow looked like had just changed significantly, and she was running calculations that would have felt academic an hour ago. She looked at Draven. He was watching Zevran with an expression she had seen exactly once before. The night a border garrison sent an emergency communication that 2 Eastern territorial agreements had collapsed simultaneously. He wore that expression for approximately 4 seconds before rebuilding control over his face. The expression said, in the language of a man who never admitted to it, I may have made a significant error in how I modeled this situation. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a kind of sorrowful recognition. He was good at this. He was genuinely good at rule and strategy and the brutal calculus of empire, and he had still made this error because he had not correctly weighted one variable. Her. He had not accurately assessed what she would do when pushed to the wall, which meant he had not accurately assessed her at all. That understanding arrived not with heat, but with cold, the clean cold of clarity after long fog. I would speak with Soralia privately, Draven said. The shift in his tone was so subtle that most of the hall probably missed it. She didn't. Before any further, she can walk to you or away from you, Zevran said. Either is her choice. I don't speak for her. They both looked at her. 8,000 people in that hall, and every single set of eyes that could see the dais was on her face. She stood inside that weight of attention and let it be exactly what it was. She did not perform calm. She did not perform anguish. She did not perform anything. She existed in the moment with the full specificity of a woman who has just been publicly discarded and is running the numbers with everything she has because the numbers are what she has left. One option, step toward Draven. Private conversation. Possible negotiation of terms. Possible. She ran this scenario and discarded it in approximately 3 seconds. Reconciliation. She was not naive. He did not want reconciliation. He wanted to manage her, to ensure she exited the situation on terms that served House Kalor's interests. The private conversation would be an exercise in making her compliance feel like her choice. She knew how that conversation would go. She had seen it happen to other women in these halls, had watched them walk into private rooms following public humiliations and emerge with carefully negotiated settlements and carefully managed public statements and carefully contained damage to the houses that had wronged them. They called it dignity. She had always thought it looked more like continued employment. Another option, say nothing, stand on the dais until the ceremony's collapse forced procedural movement. Let the council's chaos run its course. Allow the night to proceed without making a defining choice in front of witnesses, and reserve her real decisions for private. That option was safe. It was also, she understood with the crystalline precision of someone who has just lost everything she had been careful about. Finished. Being careful had brought her to this dais in ivory and silver thread. Being careful had preserved her position in a house that was filing paperwork to remove her for 6 weeks while she attended its council sessions. Careful was done. She looked at Zevran Morvain. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had since he walked through the doors. Not expectant, not directing. Patient in the way that very competent people are patient, without urgency, because they have already run the outcomes and understand that waiting costs them nothing while giving the other party the opportunity to make the wrong move. You said she is free to leave, she said to him. Yes. Free to decide her future beyond House Kalor. Yes. Why does that benefit you? It was the right question, and she knew it was the right question, and she watched him understand that she knew. A muscle at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more considered than a smile. Tonight significantly weakens Kaelor's position in 3 territorial conversations I've been conducting for the past year, he said. That is straightforward. Yes. She held his gaze. And the less straightforward part? The hall had gone very, very quiet. Zevran looked at her for a long moment, not assessing, not searching, looking the way a person looks when they are deciding something about honesty. I refuse to waste strength because someone else lacked vision, he said. Simple, direct, containing no romance whatsoever, which was precisely what made it the most honest thing spoken in that room all evening. Soralia. Draven's voice had changed again. She heard it and catalogued it and felt the complicated, unsentimental thing it produced in her chest. He was not performing for the court now. That voice was not a public instrument. This is wounded pride talking. I understand that. I understand what tonight looks like, Gus. Do you? She turned to face him fully. Tell me what tonight looks like. He stopped. Tell me what you think I'm seeing right now. Her voice remained level. She was faintly amazed by that, and faintly grateful, and did not allow either feeling to surface. Tell me what wound I'm speaking from. You are reacting to the public nature of... I'm not reacting to the public nature of anything. She took one step toward him. The hall did not breathe. I am responding to a sequence of information I have just received. You filed a petition 6 weeks ago. You allowed me to continue in my position, attend council, advise on border strategy, participate in treaty discussions. For 6 weeks while that petition moved through your sealed chamber. You staged this moment because you needed me in position for the ceremony's legal validity. You did not discard me. You used me until the moment my usefulness was concluded. Those are facts. I am not reacting to them. I am deciding what to do with them. Draven was very still. That is what clarity looks like, she said. Not humiliation, not wounded pride, respect. For myself, which I spent 3 years offering to this house instead. The words fell into absolute silence. And something shifted in the room. Not physically, politically, which in an empire like this was the only shift that produced lasting consequences. She felt it. She was certain Zevran felt it. She was absolutely certain Draven felt it, because she watched the color shift very slightly beneath his jaw, and she had spent 3 years learning that tell. He reached for her wrist. Not violently. That was the part she would remember afterward. Not as a mercy, but as a data point. He reached for her the way a man reaches for something he has just understood he is about to lose, not through intention, but through the biological reflex of loss aversion, the body moving while the mind is still processing. His fingers closed around her wrist, the bare wrist where the soul mark had been. The contact produced in her exactly nothing. Not warmth, not pain, not even revulsion. The absence of feeling was its own information, the cleanest kind of confirmation she could have received. Zevran moved, not toward Draven, toward the space between them. One step forward, unhurried, with the particular quality of movement that belonged to people who had spent long enough in genuine danger that urgency had become redundant. They were either already prepared or they were already dead, so urgency itself was decoration. He stopped just inside the range that mattered. Kaelor guards moved to flanking positions along the hall's perimeter. Zevran's absence of escorts suddenly seemed less like carelessness and more like a statement. He had walked into this palace alone because he had calculated that alone was sufficient. The king, Zevran said quietly, who discards loyalty publicly should not be shocked when consequence arrives publicly. Draven released her wrist. It was not dramatic. It was simply the moment a man let go of something he had realized he no longer had the standing to hold. Soralia stepped back. One step. Toward Zevran. Not beside him. Not sheltered by him. Simply away from Draven, and the physics of the room meant that away from Draven was toward the Northern Emperor, and she made that choice with full understanding of how the witnesses would interpret it and made it anyway. The room erupted. She heard it the way she heard weather, present, loud, somewhere outside the specific territory of her focus. Council lords were on their feet. Balcony factions had abandoned any pretense of contained conversation. 2 Kaelor ministers were physically blocking each other's paths to the dais steps with the graceless urgency of men who could see history happening and couldn't decide whether to try to stop it or simply ensure they were on record as having tried. Draven looked at her, and in his eyes, beneath the training, beneath the authority, beneath 3 years of sovereign composure that she had watched him maintain through crises that would have broken other men, she saw the specific moment of comprehension she had been unconsciously waiting for. He had expected her to be broken. He had engineered a moment designed to produce a woman too humiliated to be strategic, too wounded to be dangerous. He had performed the rejection before witnesses because a broken woman performs her grief publicly and in doing so becomes manageable, becomes a narrative that the court can file away as concluded, a sympathy story, a cautionary example of the cost of bonding with a king who outgrows you. He had not planned for her to stand there filing information instead. He had not planned for her to stop loving him and start thinking before he finished his first sentence. He had not planned for this. Soralia. His voice broke on the second syllable, just fractionally, just enough. She heard it. She chose not to respond to it. Because the most devastating thing she could do in that moment, the thing that would reach past his authority and his composure and his strategic calculation into whatever remained of the man underneath, was to show him that she had already finished grieving him. That the grief had happened in the 3 seconds between his first sentence and the smoke of the dying soul mark, in some private interior room that he would never have access to, and by the time she stood on the dais and met his eyes, she had already passed through it and arrived somewhere he could not follow. She turned to Zevran. "Tell me about your northern road," she said. It was not romantic, it was not performed. It was the question of a woman gathering intelligence about her next territory. Zevran looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Cold, honest, nothing like this." She nodded once and began to walk. Not fast, not dramatically. Simply with the particular quality of movement that belongs to people who have decided and who have nothing left in the room behind them worth hesitating for. She had descended 3 steps from the throne dais when the sound of the doors closing behind Draven's guards created a vacuum of attention that made the hall feel like a held breath. Then she heard him. Soralia. Once. Just her name. In a voice stripped of everything his position had ever required of it. She kept walking. The Grand Hall of Sovereigns had no back entrance. It was designed that way, a statement of imperial openness, theoretically accessible to all, practically controlled at every threshold. She walked toward the primary entrance and the northern wind came through the still open bronze doors and met her like something that had been waiting at a significant distance and finally arrived. Zivran fell into step beside her, not in front, not behind, alongside, and she was aware of his presence the way she was aware of weather, real, relevant, neither threatening nor comforting by default, something to factor accurately. They passed through the doors. The cold of outside hit her like a correction. Behind them, 8,000 witnesses redistributed themselves into 1,000 political conversations that would run through the night and into the morning and into the history of Kaelor's empire for the next century. Draven stood on the palace steps. She knew because she could feel the specific quality of his attention at her back. She had developed that sensitivity over 3 years, and it did not simply switch off because she had decided to stop serving its object. He called her name once more. She did not turn, but she heard it, and she would remember it. Not with tenderness, and not with victory, and not with grief. She would remember it with the careful accuracy of someone filing away true information about a complicated subject for later use, in a world where later was now the territory she actually lived in. The northern road stretched ahead of them. Her attendants, terrified, confused, caught between imperial loyalty and personal devotion, had followed at a distance, and she heard their footsteps behind her now, tentative on the cobblestones. Zevran spoke without looking at her. "You have questions?" "Several hundred," she said. "We have time." "That is not confirmed," she said, "considering I just made enemies publicly in the most documented hall in the Eastern Territories." "Yes." His voice was almost dry. "You're going to need a different kind of backing." She looked at him directly. He was watching the northern horizon, and in the torchlight his profile had the quality of something that had been through sufficient difficulty that it no longer needed to perform readiness. "Tell me one true thing," she said, "without strategy in it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have never retrieved someone because they were worth retrieving," he said. "I retrieved you because Draven would not have, and that told me something about his judgment that I needed confirmed before I moved on his northern corridor agreements." She processed that. That is entirely strategy, she said. Yes. He glanced at her. But it's true. She almost laughed. Not warmly, not with amusement, with the particular quality of laughter that belongs to people who have arrived somewhere so far outside their plans that the only honest response is sound. The Northern Corridor agreements, she said. He has 3 of them. Had 3 of them. You're already moving. I've been moving for 2 years. He returned his gaze to the road. Tonight simply changed the public record. They were passing through the outer gates of the palace grounds now, and the city of Velmora spread below them in its nighttime organization of lamplight and shadow. Behind them, through the gates she could not bring herself to look back at, the palace burned with its ceremonial fires and its 8,000 witnesses, and its king standing on the steps, learning what it felt like to watch consequence move away from you on its own feet. She thought about 3 years. She thought about the council sessions and the treaty analyses and the border strategy briefings she had participated in with genuine investment, had offered her sharpest thinking to, had stayed awake for when others went to sleep. She thought about the intelligence she had developed about Kaylor's court, its fault lines, its dependencies, its pressure points. She thought about all of it, and she thought about where she was walking. She thought, I have just become the most strategically valuable person in either empire. Not because of the Soul Bond's dissolution, because of what I know. And I am walking into the Northern Emperor's sphere with 3 years of Kaylor intelligence in my head and absolutely nothing to lose. She turned to Zevran. What's your weakest trade corridor? She asked. He looked at her. She asked. For the first time, something shifted in his expression that wasn't controlled. It was brief, and he recovered it quickly, but she had spent 3 years training herself to catch exactly that quality of fleeting reaction. It was interest, genuine, unperformed interest. The Velhari passage, he said. Kyler's been pressuring the secondary merchants since late winter. I know. She had reviewed those reports. She had in fact written a strategic analysis of the Velhari situation that had been presented to Draven's council 4 months ago. An analysis recommending precisely the kind of pressure Kaylor had subsequently applied. Zevran understood that in the same moment she said it. The silence between them changed quality. They walked through the first long stretch of the northern road while the city of Velmora slid past them in its lamplight and the palace fires burned behind them at a distance that increased with every step. Then, from ahead, a rider appeared on the road. Full gallop, bearing the markings of the Velhari Merchant Confederation. The rider pulled up before them, horse blowing great steam clouds into the cold night air, and extended a sealed document to Zevran with shaking hands. Zevran broke the seal and read in the torchlight. His face did not change, but the quality of his stillness did. The particular quality of a man who has received information that restructures everything he believed he understood about the next 6 months. He handed the letter to Soralia without explanation. She read it. The words were very clear. The Velhari passage had been closed, not pressured, not disrupted, closed. All Morvain-affiliated merchants had been held at the secondary gates pending imperial review, and the document authorizing the hold bore the Kaylor seal. But the Kaylor seal, she looked more carefully at the mark, was the old seal, the seal from before the redesign 8 months ago, the one that had been officially retired and reclaimed by the palace archives. A seal that could only have come from inside the palace, from inside Kaylor. She looked up at Zevran. He was watching her with an expression that had nothing controlled about it for the first time. Someone inside your court, she said. Yes. Someone who has been planning this for at least 8 months. Yes. And tonight, she held the letter. Tonight is not a coincidence. He said nothing, because they both already knew. Draven's public severance, the deliberate timing, the manufactured spectacle, the precise moment chosen to maximize chaos in Kyler's court and draw every lord's attention to the dais, while, somewhere in the Velhari passage, a forged seal closed a trade corridor that would trigger exactly the kind of escalating conflict that could destabilize 2 empires simultaneously. The question was not whether someone had engineered tonight. The question was who. And the question beneath that, the one that sat in Soralia's chest with the weight of genuine danger, was whether she had just walked willingly into the center of something that was not about her at all. She looked at the northern road. She looked at the rider, still waiting, still breathing hard, with the expression of a man carrying more than one message. "There's a second document," she said. The rider did not deny it. He reached inside his riding coat, and what he produced was not a letter. It was a small, lacquered box bearing the seal of a house that had not existed for 40 years. A house that had been erased from imperial record following a conflict so catastrophic that both Kylor and Morvain had agreed, in the rare unified diplomatic moment of their history, that the name itself should not appear in official documents. A house that Soralia knew, because her mother had been born into it. She stood on the northern road with the cold coming down from the mountains and the palace fires behind her and the lacquered box in the rider's hands, and she understood with the specific terror of a very intelligent person who has just realized they are not the player but the piece. That tonight had nothing to do with Draven's political ambitions. It had nothing to do with Zevran's corridor strategies. It had to do with her. It had always been about her, and somewhere in the palace behind her, or in the darkness ahead, or in one of the lamplight windows of the city they had just passed through, someone who knew exactly who she was watching her stand on that road and waiting for her to open the box. She looked at Zevran. He was watching the box, and for the first time since she had met him, his face showed something she did not have data to interpret. "Did you know?" she asked. He took a very long time to answer. "Not all of it," he said, which was not the same as no. She reached for the box. Her fingers touched the lacquered surface, and the cold of it went through her skin like a current finding ground. The box was small enough to fit in one hand. Black lacquer worn at the corners in the specific way that things wear when they have been handled repeatedly over a long span of time. Not carelessly, but with the kind of deliberate, frequent attention that implied ritual. The seal pressed into its surface was silver gray, oxidized to the color of old scar tissue, and she recognized the design not from documents or official records, but from a piece of jewelry she had last seen when she was 9 years old, around the throat of a woman who had told her never to speak of where it came from. Her mother had been many things. Careful had been the most exhausting of them. She did not open the box on the road. Instinct, or something older than instinct, something that lived in the body below the level of reason, told her that opening it here, in the open, on a road that ran between a palace she had just left and a future she had not yet mapped, with a rider she did not know watching her hands, and an emperor she did not yet trust standing close enough to read her expression, was the precise wrong way to encounter whatever was inside. She closed her fingers around it instead. "I'll hold this," she said. To no one specifically. To the night. The rider looked at Zevran. Zevran looked at Soralia. "That's her choice," Zevran said, and there was no inflection in it that suggested he considered it otherwise. The rider nodded and turned his horse and disappeared back down the northern road at the same gallop he'd arrived at, leaving behind nothing but the rapidly fading sound of hooves on stone and the cold dark, and two people standing in it with the specific weight of unshared information between them. Soralia closed her fist around the box and kept walking. Zevran matched her pace without comment. This was the thing she filed away second about him, after the fact of his honesty about strategy. He did not fill silence. Most powerful men she had encountered, and she had encountered an extraordinary number of them across 3 years in Kaler's court, treated silence as a vacuum they were obligated to fill, as though quiet represented some loss of authority that only their voice could reclaim. Draven had done it. Every council lord she had ever sat beside had done it. They talked because silence felt to them like exposure. Zevran seemed to find silence structurally useful. He waited in it the way a man waits in a room he has already checked for exits. Comfortable. Attentive. Not passive. "You said not all of it," she said finally, when the palace lights had reduced themselves to a glow on the horizon behind them, and the first stretch of true northern darkness had settled around the road. "Yes." "What part did you know?" He considered his answer for several paces. She appreciated that he actually considered it rather than reaching for the most immediately plausible response. Men who answered too quickly in complex situations were usually choosing from a prepared list rather than actually thinking. "I knew the house seal existed," he said. "I knew it had surfaced 3 months ago in a market in the Southern Territories. A merchant selling old documents, estate clearances. Someone bought it before my agent could. I knew what house it belonged to. I knew that House's dissolution was connected to events that preceded both Kaelor and Morvaine's current dynasties. But you didn't know it was connected to me. A pause. I knew it was connected to someone inside either Kaelor or Morvaine's inner circle, he said. The timing of the Velhari closure, the method. Those were precision moves, someone who understood both empires from the inside. And tonight accelerated a timeline I hadn't fully mapped yet. She thought about that. You intervened in the ceremony, she said, before you knew what was in the box. Yes. So the seal, my connection to it, that's information you just received, at the same time you did. She looked at the box in her hand. The cold of the lacquer had adjusted to her body temperature now. It was warmer than it had been. That seemed like the wrong direction for things to go. Then why did you come tonight? She said. If it wasn't about this. I told you why. Corridor strategy. Yes. You walked into Kaelor's most formal state ceremony, unannounced, alone, and publicly inserted yourself into a sovereign proceeding for corridor strategy. He glanced at her with something at the corner of his expression that might have been, in a different man, a hint of embarrassment at having a rational position made to sound insufficient. The corridor situation is significant, he said. I'm not disputing the corridor situation. She kept her voice level. I'm observing that the risk-to-benefit calculation of what you did tonight solely for corridor strategy does not compute to a positive outcome for you in any scenario I can model. Silence. Unless, she said, the corridor was not the primary variable. He did not answer, which was an answer. She filed it, not with alarm and not with warmth, but with the careful accuracy of a woman who has just learned that she needs to reassess the map of tonight from the beginning because one of its key coordinates was mismarked. This was the brutal philosophy of survival inside empires, and she had learned it the hardest possible way. Every actor in a room had a motive, and the motive they presented was rarely the motive that drove them. Not because powerful people were uniquely dishonest, but because power itself required the management of multiple competing objectives simultaneously, and the objective you led with was always a calculation about which truth made you most manageable to the room. Draven had led with legal procedure. His actual objective had been control of her exit. Zevran had led with corridor strategy. His actual objective was, she did not yet have sufficient data for that sentence to conclude. And someone else, bearing a seal from a house that had been erased from imperial record, had led with a lacquered box. Their actual objective was the variable she most needed to understand before she opened it. She thought about her mother. She thought about the jewelry, a pendant, silver gray, worn beneath her collar where no one would see it. She thought about the way her mother had touched it sometimes, not consciously, the way people touch things that remind them of something they can't quite let go of. She thought about the night her mother had shown it to her and said, in a voice with all the warmth removed to make the information cleaner, that there were things Soralia would need to understand about her bloodline when she was older. Her mother had died before she was older enough, and the pendant had disappeared with her. Someone had found it, or found what it represented, or always known, and was only now choosing to use the knowledge. Those were 3 different threats, and she did not yet know which one was walking toward her. The road ahead curved around a stand of black pine that marked the beginning of the true Northern Territory, the transitional zone where Kaelor's provincial governance ended and the complex patchwork of Morvaine's acquired territories began. She had read the maps. She knew the political geography the way she knew most things, thoroughly, because thorough was the only kind of knowledge that was actually useful when the room caught fire. Zevran's forward camp was 2 hours from the palace on a fast horse, slower on foot. She was wearing ceremonial shoes. As though reading that thought, or simply observing the same practical reality, Zevran stopped walking. She stopped. From the tree line, 4 riders appeared, not at speed, controlled. They bore Morvaine markings, northern military livery, and they led 2 additional horses saddled for travel. One of them dismounted and approached with a heavy riding cloak and held it out to her without making eye contact, which told her something about the caliber of the people Zevran kept close. Trained enough not to perform deference, disciplined enough not to perform familiarity. She took the cloak. You had people in position, she said. I had people in position, he said. She pulled the cloak around her and the warmth was immediate and practical and not at all romantic, and she was profoundly grateful for it in a way that had nothing to do with the man who had provided it, and everything to do with the fact that her feet were already going numb. She mounted the horse they brought her without assistance. She had learned to ride at 7 and had maintained the skill without sentimentality. It was a survival competency, like reading contracts and reading rooms, and she treated it the same way. They rode. The night deepened around the northern road, and the pine smell came up strong and clean and entirely indifferent to the political catastrophe that had just occurred in the imperial hall behind them, which Soralia found, obscurely, a significant relief. She pressed the lacquered box against her ribs inside the cloak. After a while, Zevran's voice came through the dark beside her. "Tell me about your mother." She did not react visibly. She was getting better at that, the not reacting visibly to direct strikes. "Why?" "Because the seal belongs to a house I know the record of, and the record doesn't include a surviving bloodline. Whoever sent that box believes otherwise." "What do you know about the house?" "Vial," he said, and then nothing else. The name landed in her chest the way her mother's hand had sometimes landed on her shoulder, with a weight that was not aggressive but was absolutely not gentle either. "You know the name," he said. Not a question. "My mother's name before her marriage was Vane," she said. "She changed it when she married my father. Vane was a Kalor provincial surname, common, no bloodline implications. But before Vane..." Silence on the road. The trees moved in a wind she couldn't feel at ground level. "She never told me her name before Vane," Soralia said. Which was true, and was also not the complete truth. And she was aware that Zevran was likely aware of that distinction, and she was choosing to provide the true portion while retaining the incomplete portion until she knew more about why he was asking. He accepted the answer without pushing it. That was interesting. A man who wanted leverage would have pushed. A man who wanted to understand would have waited. She still did not know which one he was. She was aware that this uncertainty was itself a kind of answer about her situation, and that the answer was insufficient data, proceed with caution, keep the box closed until you are behind walls you have had time to assess. She kept riding. The Morvain forward camp appeared at the end of the second hour as a collection of organized light in the darkness. Torches rather than sorcery fire, which told her something about the pragmatism of Zevran's military culture. Sorcery fire was more permanent, but required ongoing maintenance by trained practitioners and carried political implications about wealth. Torches were cheap and replaceable and carried by anyone. The camp used what worked, not what impressed. She approved of that without saying so. The camp was larger than Forward implied. 300 soldiers minimum, she estimated from the tent organization and the horse lines. Supply wagons staged at the perimeter. She saw communication runners moving between structures with the coordinated efficiency of a functioning military organization, not an improvised position. He had not come to Velmora for a ceremony. He had come prepared to stay. "How long have you been camped here?" she said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. So Draven's 6-week petition timeline had been public to someone else as well. Or Zevran had mapped the corridor situation's acceleration and positioned himself accordingly, and tonight's ceremony had been an opportunity rather than the primary objective. Both scenarios were possible. Neither made her more comfortable. A tent had been prepared for her. She noted its position in the camp, near the command structure but not adjacent to Zevran's personal quarters, which were identified by the military protocol around them. Either he or whoever organized his camp had understood that placing her close to him immediately would have the particular quality of a statement she hadn't agreed to make. She noted the consideration. She did not assign it a value yet. Inside the tent was a small brazier, a camp table, a chair, and a cot with adequate blankets. No excess, no staging, the absolute minimum comfort for a person who had just left a palace in ceremonial clothes on a cold night, provided without theater. She set the lacquered box on the camp table, looked at it, then looked at Zevran, who had followed her to the tent entrance and stopped there. Outside rather than in. She noted that too. "I need to know," she said, "whether your people have been in contact with anyone bearing this house's markings before tonight." "No." "I need to know whether you have documentation of the House Vial dissolution." "At the command tent. I can have it brought." "Yes." She held his gaze. "And I need to know what you want from me." The directness of it sat between them for a moment. He did not perform surprise. He did not perform offense. He studied her with the same attentive, non-performing quality she had identified as fundamental to how he occupied a room, and then he answered with the kind of honesty that was either genuine or the most sophisticated version of manipulation she had ever encountered. "I want to know what's in that box," he said, "because whatever it is, it changes my next 6 months of strategy significantly, and I would rather know than not know. And in exchange, you have the resources of a northern empire and 3 weeks of established camp position and nobody in this territory who has cause to think you're anything other than what you choose to be." She thought about Draven's palace. She thought about the council sessions. She thought about 3 years of making herself useful in rooms that had never actually needed her. Rooms that had needed her performance of usefulness while quietly filing the actual usefulness away in Draven's strategic reserve. She thought about what her mother had never told her. "Bring me the documentation," she said, "and leave me alone with it." He inclined his head and withdrew. She sat down in front of the box. The camp sounds came through the tent walls. The efficient human noise of a military position at night, someone calling a watch change, horses moving at the line. The low conversation of soldiers who had been waiting without being told exactly what they were waiting for. Normal sounds. Practical sounds. Nothing like the silver chandeliers and silk banners of the Grand Hall of Sovereigns, which felt, in this moment, like something she had dreamed during a fever. She opened the box. Inside was a single document, folded twice, on paper so old it had achieved the color of old skin, and beneath it, nested in black velvet, her mother's pendant, the silver-gray chain, the oxidized seal mark, exactly as she remembered it against her mother's collar when she was 9 years old. Her hands did not shake. She noticed the absence of shaking as a data point about her own psychology. She was past the threshold of surprise for tonight, had crossed some invisible line of accumulated shock that had paradoxically produced a kind of steadiness. The nervous system, when overloaded past a certain level, sometimes stopped producing alarm and started producing clarity. She had read about this in medical texts during a period of insomnia and had found it more useful than comfort. She lifted the pendant out first, held it. The metal was cold against her palm, and then, slowly, not. She closed her fingers around it and felt nothing mystical, nothing dramatic. Just the weight of a small piece of metal that her mother had valued enough to hide and someone had valued enough to return. She unfolded the document. The language was old, not incomprehensibly so. She had studied historical legal texts as part of her council preparation and could read 3 registers of the language, including the formal court dialect that had been retired from common use approximately 80 years ago. This was written in that dialect, with the particular precision of legal record. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a period of time that might have been 10 minutes or 40, and did not have the resources to determine which. What the document said was this: the House of Vial had not been dissolved. Not entirely. Its dissolution, as recorded in both Kaelor and Morvain imperial documentation, had been a negotiated falsification. A mutually agreed erasure conducted between the two empires specifically to protect the surviving member of the Vale bloodline, who had been placed under concealed identity and relocated to Kaelor's provincial territories. Under the name Vane, her mother had not changed her name to hide a common origin. She had changed her name to hide the only surviving heir of an erased imperial house, and then had died before she could explain what that meant, or what it required, or what it was that someone had clearly been waiting for Soralia to eventually become old enough and positioned enough to be useful to. She was not a woman who had been collateral to Draven's ambitions. She was not an obstacle he had discarded. She was the thing both empires had agreed to hide 40 years ago, now standing in the open on a northern road with her mother's pendant in her hand and no walls around her that she had chosen. And whoever had sent this box knew it and had chosen tonight, of all possible nights, to tell her. The tent flap opened and she stood up fast, hand going to the table edge, before she registered that it was Zevran's document courier, a soldier of maybe 25 with the carefully neutral expression of someone doing their job precisely without engaging with its implications. He set the documentation on the table edge and left without speaking. She remained standing. Then she sat back down, pulled the Morvain documentation in front of her, and began to read alongside her own document with the systematic focus of someone cross-referencing information under time pressure. The Morvain records on Vale were thorough. She would give him that. They covered the house's history, its territory, its dissolution conflict, described in cold bureaucratic language that failed entirely to contain the scale of what it was describing, which was the systematic dismantling of an imperial bloodline through what appeared to be coordinated action by Kaelor and Morvain's predecessor dynasties. And then the public record simply stopped. But there were annotations in the margins, handwritten, recent, in a different ink, in Zevran's handwriting, which she had seen on treaty documents and recognized by its particular quality, left-handed, controlled, with the compression of a man who wrote quickly and had learned to contain his script to fit available space. He had been reading these records, he had been annotating them, for the past 2 years. She picked up the document and walked out of the tent. He was 15 feet away, standing with 2 of his senior officers over a camp map by torchlight, and he saw her coming and said something to the officers that sent them in a different direction without urgency, but without hesitation. She stopped in front of him and held up the annotated page. 2 years, she said. He looked at the page. Yes. You've been researching this for 2 years. Yes. While simultaneously researching Kaelor's corridor agreements. Research does not preclude other research. Don't. Her voice came out flat, with an edge that surprised her slightly. Not the content of it, but the cleanness. Don't manage this conversation. Tell me what you know and when you knew it and what you intended to do with it, because I have just read a document that tells me my entire understanding of my own history is wrong. And I am sitting in your military camp on a night when someone chose this specific moment to put that document in my hands, and you have 2 years of annotations in the margins of records about my family's house. And you are going to give me the truth right now, or I will walk back to Velmora and set every one of Draven's corridor agreements on fire from the inside, and you will spend the next decade rebuilding what tonight was supposed to accomplish. Silence. The camp moved around them, indifferent, operational. Zevran looked at her for a long time, not with calculation, with something she didn't immediately have a name for, something that lived adjacent to respect but was bigger than respect, something that showed up in a person's face when they encounter a situation that exceeds their preparation for it. Sit down, he said. Please. The please was unexpected enough that she sat. He crouched to her eye level, not kneeling, not standing over her, crouching, which was the position of a person who wanted to speak on equal ground without making a production of the gesture. What I know, he said, is that the Vale dissolution was negotiated between my dynasty's founder and Kaelor's predecessor king 70 years ago, following a war that neither empire wanted recorded in detail. The Vale bloodline held a territorial covenant, not land, not military force, but a legal covenant embedded in the original imperial compacts that predated both Kaelor and Morvain as formal empires. A covenant that, if it were ever formally invoked by a living Vale heir, would require both empires to submit to an independent arbitration of their territorial boundaries. She processed this. Both empires, she said, every corridor, every acquisition, every treaty conducted in the past century, subject to review under a legal framework that neither Kaelor nor Morvain wrote, and neither can control. So they erased the bloodline. They erased the record. They did not, apparently, succeed in erasing the bloodline. She thought about her mother's pendant, the way it was hidden, the way her mother had never explained. She didn't know, Soralia said, or she knew part of it and not enough of it to act on. That is my assessment as well. And now someone has told me. Yes. Someone who wants me to invoke the covenant. That is the logical conclusion. She sat with that for a moment. Around her the campfire moved in a northern wind, and the soldiers maintained their watch rotations with the systematic competence of people who had been doing it long enough not to require supervision. And somewhere back down the southern road, a king was standing in a palace that had just become significantly smaller. Who? She said. Zevran was quiet. Zevran. She used his name for the first time and watched him notice it. Who sent the box? I don't know who sent it, he said. I know who would benefit from you invoking the covenant, besides the obvious. Besides anyone who wants leverage over both empires simultaneously. Yes. He looked toward the tree line, then back to her. There is a third power, not military, not provincial. Old money, old networks, old enough that most of the current imperial families don't take them seriously as a threat because they haven't acted overtly in 4 decades. 4 decades, she said, since the Veil dissolution. She thought about that timeline. She thought about it very carefully. They've been waiting, she said. They've been positioning. Waiting implies passivity. What they've been doing is more like tending, maintaining a seed they intended to germinate under specific conditions. And the conditions? A living Veil heir, adult and capable, in possession of the covenant documentation at a moment of maximum instability between the two empires. She looked at him directly. You came tonight, she said. You accelerated the instability. You walked into that hall knowing what Draven was going to do, and you made it public and irreversible. You forced me out into the open. His jaw tightened fractionally. I did not know about the box, he said. I did not know your connection to Veil. But you knew something was being positioned. Silence. I suspected, he said, that tonight had more variables than Draven's corridor ambitions. I was positioned to observe. You inserted yourself into my severance ceremony to observe. I inserted myself because the situation was being used against you in a way I found strategically unnecessary and personally objectionable. A pause. In that order, yes. She studied his face. The torchlight made it harder to read, which she was aware was a limitation she couldn't compensate for right now, which was itself a problem. She thought about instincts. She thought about the ways instincts were simultaneously the most reliable data she possessed and the most susceptible to manipulation. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years researching her mother's family and had shown up in the precise moment of her most public vulnerability and had provided her with shelter and documentation and honest strategy and had told her things she did not want to hear in a voice that carried no performance in it. She thought about the fact that she had been maneuvered before and had not seen it until it was complete. She thought about the specific quality of the anger that produced. What do you want? She said. The real answer, all the way through. He looked at the ground for a moment. She watched him decide something. I want the covenant arbitration, he said, because there are 3 territorial boundaries in my northern empire that were established under duress by my dynasty's founder and that I cannot renegotiate through current channels because Kaelor holds blocking positions on all 3. The arbitration framework would open those conversations under neutral governance. He met her eyes. That is the strategic answer. And the non-strategic answer? A long silence. Draven had something built that he treated like furniture, Zevran said. That has always seemed to me like a particular kind of waste that I don't have patience for. I don't know if that answers your question. It didn't fully answer it, but it was true. And she could tell it was true. And true was what she was working with tonight because everything else had proven insufficient. She stood up. I'm not invoking the covenant tonight, she said. I need documentation I can verify independently, and I need time to think, and I need to understand who sent the box and what they expect to gain before I give them what they're positioning me to give them. Yes. That means I'm staying. Yes? Not because I trust you. I haven't asked you to trust me. Then what have you asked me? He looked at her steadily. To think accurately about your situation, he said, which you appear to be doing. She looked at the pendant in her hand, the oxidized silver, the seal of a house that was supposed to be gone. I'm going to need a courier I choose myself, she said, sent to a contact in Velmora who is not affiliated with either house. Done. And I'm going to need access to your full documentation on Veil, not the summary, everything. Done. And if I determine that you have been playing me as a piece in someone else's strategy, she stopped. Let the end of that sentence stay unspoken, because the implied content was more effective than the explicit. He held her gaze without flinching. Then you will have the covenant documentation and the legal standing to invoke it, he said quietly, and you will not need me for anything. She let that sit between them. Then she turned and walked back toward her tent. At the entrance, she stopped, her back to him. The third party, she said. The ones who sent the box. You said they've been positioning for 4 decades. Yes. And they sent the box tonight, which means they knew tonight was happening. Yes. Which means they have someone inside either your camp or Draven's palace. She heard him exhale, very slightly. Or both, he said. She went into the tent. She sat down with her mother's pendant and the covenant document and the annotated Morvain records, and she began systematically to build the actual map of tonight from the beginning. It took her 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, she had a working framework and several significant gaps and one conclusion that sat in her chest with the weight of something that had no good resolution. She stepped outside. The camp was deep into its night watch rotations. The fires had reduced. The stars overhead were the cold northern variety, brilliant and indifferent, and she stood in their light and thought about her mother hiding a pendant beneath her collar for 20 years and never explaining why. Zevran was at the command tent. She could see the light through the canvas, the shadow of a man still working. She walked to him. He looked up when she entered. Not surprised. She suspected he had been monitoring the light in her tent. "There's someone in your camp," she said. "Not planted against you, planted against me. They've been waiting for confirmation that I was here." He was very still. "The writer," she said. "The one who brought the box. He rode ahead of us. We came by horse from the second hour. He was here before us." Silence. "He didn't come from Velmora," she said. "He was already inside your perimeter." Zevran stood up. "Which means," she said, "whoever sent the box knew I would be in this camp before you did." The implications of that expanded between them like something filling a room. Before Zevran had walked into the grand hall of sovereigns, before the severance ceremony, before the night had become what it became, someone had positioned a rider in the Northern Emperor's forward camp with a document about her bloodline and her mother's pendant, knowing she would arrive. Not hoping, knowing, which meant the entire night, Draven's public ceremony, Zevran's intervention, her walk out of the palace, had been anticipated, possibly designed. She looked at Zevran and he looked at her, and the question that sat between them was the same question, and neither of them spoke it because speaking it made it more real, and real was the territory they were both already standing in without wanting to confirm its dimensions. "The covenant," she said. "Yes. If I invoke it, every territorial agreement in both empires goes under arbitration. Neither Draven nor I control the process. Neither of us controls the outcome. But someone does. Someone structured this so that a specific person controls the arbitration framework," he said. "Yes. Who arbitrates?" He picked up his own documentation and found a page near the back, turned it toward her. She read the relevant line, then read it again. The arbitration framework named as its governing body a council. 7 seats. 6 of the seat designations were tied to geographical territories that had shifted over the past century, their current holders indeterminate pending legal review. The 7th seat was designated by name. The name was Vale. She looked up. "If I invoke the covenant," she said, "I don't just trigger the arbitration. I chair it." Yes. Her heart rate changed. She was aware of it changing, and she noted the awareness and sat very carefully with what it meant. Not fear, not ambition, something more complicated than either. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a drop in the dark and understanding simultaneously that falling was terrible and that you had been climbing toward this edge for a very long time without knowing it. "They positioned me to control both empires' territorial future," she said. "Yes. Someone spent 40 years on this." "Yes." She thought about her mother's pendant, the jewelry hidden beneath the collar, the careful, exhausting, lifelong carefulness. She thought about Draven filing a petition 6 weeks ago and walking beside her through these corridors for 6 weeks knowing. She thought about the grand hall and the silver smoke and the bare skin of her wrist. She thought about walking through those bronze doors and down the northern road in someone else's riding cloak with someone else's camp ahead of her. She thought about the rider who had been waiting, about the box that was already here. She looked at Zevran. "I need you to find the rider," she said. "I've already sent 2. I need you to find him before whoever positioned him realizes we know to look," she said, "because the rider is the thread. And if we lose the thread tonight, we won't find it again before this moves into the open." He was already moving toward the tent entrance. "One more thing," she said. He stopped. "Draven is going to come after me." She kept her voice flat and factual. Not tonight, tomorrow, or the day after, when his counsel has had time to assess what tonight means for the corridor agreements, and someone explains to him that I walked out with enough K-lore intelligence in my head to restructure every territorial negotiation he's currently managing. He will come after me, and he will want to make it look like retrieval rather than pursuit, and he will bring enough force to make the distinction academic. Zevran looked at her. And when he does, she said, I cannot be here. Where do you need to be? She picked up the covenant document from the table where she'd set it when she walked in. She looked at the seal. Her family's seal. Her seal, apparently, under a law so old it predated the empires that had tried to erase it. I need to be in the Velhari Passage, she said. Tonight, before Draven moves, before your camp becomes a target, and before whoever sent this box decides I've had enough time to think. A pause. The Velhari Passage is currently closed, Zevran said. I know. She met his eyes. I'm the one who advised Kylor on how to close it. The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence that had come before it. Then Zevran said, very quietly, You can reopen it. I can do considerably more than that. She set the document down. I know exactly which merchant confederation leaders have been waiting for an alternative to both Kylor and Morvain pressure. I know which agreements are fragile. I know who in the passage would support a neutral governing framework if one were available. The covenant arbitration, he said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. Which means I need to get there before Draven figures out what I have, and before your third party decides to stop waiting for me to move on my own. Zevran studied her. You've had 3 hours, he said, to reconstruct the entire strategic landscape of your situation. Yes. And your conclusion is to walk directly into the most contested trade passage in the Eastern Territories, alone, without established backing, before either empire knows you're moving. Not alone. She held his gaze. I need 6 riders who know the northern corridors. I need documentation of your territorial claims. And I need you to stay here and let Draven find you when he comes. Because if he finds this camp empty, he will know we anticipated him, and he will move differently. He was very still. You want me to be the distraction, he said. I want you to be the visible piece while I become the one he doesn't know to track. She paused. Can you do that? The question sat between them in the torch-lit tent while outside the camp breathed through its night watch, and the northern stars burned their cold light, and somewhere in the Velhari Passage, a trade corridor held its breath under a forged seal, waiting for someone to arrive with the authority to open it. Zevran looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the table and put his hand flat next to the covenant document, not on it, not claiming it, just beside it, and said, in a voice with no performance in it at all, When you get to the passage, what are you going to say to them? She picked up the document. She picked up her mother's pendant and fastened it around her throat, beneath her collar, where her mother had worn it for 20 years. I'm going to tell them, she said, that the House of Vial is not dissolved. She pulled the riding cloak close around her throat, and that its heir has decided to stop being careful. She walked out of the tent and into the northern night and did not look back, and behind her she heard Zevran begin to give quiet, rapid orders to his officers, and ahead of her the road to the Velhari Passage stretched into a darkness that contained, somewhere in its depth, the rider who had brought the box and the people who had sent him, and 40 years of patience that had been waiting, specifically and deliberately and with extraordinary precision, for her. The 6 riders Zevran gave her were not decorative. She understood that within the first 20 minutes of riding, when the northernmost trail fork appeared in the darkness, and the lead rider took it without hesitation or consultation, the unmarked route, the one that did not appear on provincial maps, the one that cut 2 hours off the Velhari, approach by passing through terrain that looked impassable to anyone who hadn't crossed it before. These were not escort soldiers. They were something more specifically trained than that. She filed the information without comment and kept riding. The pendant sat against her collarbone beneath the riding cloak. She was aware of its weight in the particular way you become aware of something that has shifted from symbolic to operational. It was no longer her mother's secret. It was a legal instrument that 2 empires had spent 40 years hoping would remain buried, and she was carrying it through the dark toward a trade corridor that someone had closed with a forged seal, and she was going to open it back up with the authority of a house that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. There were moments inside extreme situations where the mind produces a strange, almost clinical calm. Not peace, not acceptance. The specific cognitive state of a person who has exceeded their emotional processing capacity and defaulted to pure function. She was in that state now, and she recognized it, and she used it the way she used every available resource, completely, without sentimentality, for as long as it held. She thought about the rider who had brought the box, the one Zevran's people were looking for in the camp. She had left before they found him, deliberately, because the finding would take time and she did not have time, and because whatever information he carried was already less important than where she was going. The thread mattered, but threads could be followed from either end. The Velhari passage was the other end. She rode. The terrain changed around the second hour. The black pine thinned and the land opened into the particular bleakness of the high northern transitional zone. Rocky ground, scrub growth, sky that felt lower here than it did over the palace, closer and less ornamented. She had read geographical surveys of this corridor, but reading surveys and riding through the actual territory in the actual dark were two different forms of knowledge, and she was learning the second kind with the specific humility of someone who had relied too long on the first. The lead rider, a compact woman of perhaps 30, with a scar along her jaw, and the posture of someone who slept light, pulled alongside her as they crested a ridge. Passage checkpoint is 3 miles, she said. Kaylor garrison. 6 soldiers minimum, probably doubled since the closure. How do you know it's doubled? Because if I'd closed a corridor I controlled and then lost the person who advised me to close it in the same night, I'd double my checkpoints. Soralia looked at her. Your name, she said. Fen. You've ridden this corridor before, Fen. Several times. For Zevran. A pause. For myself, mostly. Fen's eyes were on the ridgeline ahead. Zevran pays well and asks fewer questions than most. That's a combination worth staying near. It was honest in the same flat way that most genuinely experienced people were honest, without performance, without the softening additions that people included when they wanted their honesty to be received warmly. Soralia found it useful. The garrison checkpoint, she said. Can we go around? Around takes 6 additional hours and puts us at the passage entrance after dawn. You said you needed darkness. Yes. Then we go through a Kaylor garrison that has doubled its watch. Yes. Soralia thought about this for the time it took to cover another quarter mile of rocky ground. I have Kaylor Council documentation in my head, she said. Authorization codes, garrison command protocols, the quarterly security review format. If the checkpoint commander is following standard procedure, I can talk us through. Fen looked at her for a moment. You have garrison command protocols memorized. I attended 17 security briefings in 3 years. I was the only council member who read the garrison reports instead of accepting the summaries. Why? Because summaries are written by people who have already decided what's important. Fen was quiet for a moment. The checkpoint commander tonight is a man named Bray, she said. Captain, 8 years in the corridor garrison. He's careful, and he's not particularly loyal to Draven personally. He's loyal to the institution. Give him a procedural reason, and he'll accept it. Soralia absorbed this. You know him. I've passed his checkpoint 11 times in the past 4 years. 11 times without proper authorization. 11 times with sufficient authorization, Fen said. Those are different things. They descended the ridge toward the checkpoint lights. The garrison was exactly where the map said it would be, and it was exactly as Fen had predicted. Doubled. 12 soldiers visible at the gate structure, torches burning at close intervals, a raised barrier blocking the road. She could see the command tent behind the gate, lamplight through canvas, the shadow of someone moving inside. She straightened in the saddle and became, in the space of 3 controlled breaths, someone she had been performing for 3 years. A Kaylor Council authority on official business, whose confidence was so complete that questioning it would constitute an institutional error. She had watched Draven do this. She had observed exactly how the performance worked, not through arrogance, not through volume, but through the specific quality of certainty that made the people receiving it feel that their job was to facilitate rather than interrogate. She had never had occasion to do it herself. She was doing it now. The barrier guard raised his hand as they approached. She spoke before he found his official challenge. Council authorization, Northern Security Review. Get me your captain. The guard processed this. She watched him do it, the rapid internal calculation of someone determining whether the authority in front of him exceeded the disruption of questioning it. He got her the captain. Bray was a solid man of 50, with the careful eyes of someone who had survived long enough in a military posting to develop genuine pattern recognition. He looked at her. He looked at the 6 riders. He looked at her again. I don't have a scheduled council review, he said. The review isn't scheduled, she said. It's responsive. The corridor closure triggered an automatic inspection protocol under the Garrison Management Charter, Section 12. You'd have received the charter notification this morning. He hadn't. She knew he hadn't because the charter notification she was describing didn't exist. But she described it with such precision, Section 12, the specific terminology, the administrative framing, that his mind went immediately to whether he had missed a document rather than whether the document existed. The closure was authorized by Kylor Seal, he said. The seal is under review, she said. That's why I'm here. A beat. I'll need documentation. She reached into the riding cloak and produced the covenant document. Not because it meant anything to him. It wouldn't. Not without context. But it was old, official-looking, bearing a seal, and she handed it to him with the particular gesture of someone providing routine verification rather than staking everything on a bluff. He looked at it. He could not read the archaic dialect. He held it in his hands and looked at the seal and looked at her. She waited without visible urgency. He handed it back. Move through, he said. Captain's log will show inspection authorization. I'll need a countersignature on the return. Of course, she said. The barrier lifted. She rode through without changing pace. None of her 6 riders changed pace either. On the other side, in the dark stretch between the checkpoint and the passage entrance, she heard Fenn ride up alongside her. Section 12, Fenn said, doesn't exist. No. He's going to figure that out. In 3 to 4 hours, Soralia said. When he checks the charter and can't find the section, by then we're inside the passage, and it doesn't matter. Fenn looked at her with an expression that contained something that was not quite admiration and was probably more accurate than admiration. Zevran said you were sharp, she said. What else did he say? That you were sharper than you'd been allowed to be. A pause. He seemed to find that significant. Soralia did not respond to that. She filed it in the same place she was filing everything about Zevran tonight. Provisionally, with multiple interpretations retained, pending verification she did not yet have the resources to perform. The Velhari passage entrance appeared ahead of them in the last of the pre-dawn dark. It was not what she had imagined from the reports. The reports described it as a trade corridor, which was accurate but implied something more administrative, more managed looking. What it actually was, a gap in a ridge of black rock, wide enough for 2 supply wagons to pass side by side, with walls of stone rising 50 feet on either side and the sound of wind moving through it at a constant low frequency that made the whole thing sound like something breathing. Merchant camps lined both approaches, dozens of tents and wagons, people who had been stopped at the closure and could not move forward or back without authorization, building the particular restless community of the commercially stranded. She dismounted at this camp edge. I need the Confederation leaders, she said to Fenn, not their representatives, the leaders themselves. Tell them a council official is here about the closure and needs a private meeting. Fenn moved without further question. She waited. The cold was different here than on the open road. The passage walls trapped it, focused it, turned it from ambient weather into something more specific and pressured. She stood in it and watched the camp and thought about what she was about to do. Invoking the covenant required a formal declaration before witnesses capable of legal testimony. The Confederation merchants, as chartered trade entities under Imperial Compact, qualified. She had the document. She had the seal. She pressed her fingers briefly against the pendant beneath her collar. The bloodline, apparently. What she did not have was certainty about who was watching. The third party. The ones who had spent 40 years positioning this moment. They had known she would be in Zevran's camp before Zevran did, which meant they had operational intelligence inside both empires, which meant they were watching the passage too. And she was walking directly into the center of their 40-year plan. She was aware of this. She was proceeding anyway. Because the alternative, retreat, wait, gather more information, gave Draven time to move and the third party time to tighten their structure. And she had learned tonight that patience in the face of someone else's patience was not caution, it was surrender on a delay. She had stopped being careful. Fen returned with 3 people, 2 men and a woman, in the particular clothing of successful merchants who had been sleeping in camp conditions for several days. Expensive fabric, badly wrinkled, with the specific frayed quality of people who were accustomed to comfort and had been denied it long enough to develop visible irritation. The woman spoke first. Confederation Master Liel, you said council authorization. I said council official, Soralia corrected. The authorization I carry is older than the council. A beat of silence. The closure is illegal, Liel said. The seal on the holding order is forged. Yes. I know. Soralia looked at all 3 of them. I know because I helped design the closure protocol that seal was used to mimic. I also know who the forged seal belongs to and why it was used tonight specifically, and I have a legal mechanism to dissolve the closure permanently and prevent either Kaelor or Morvain from applying equivalent pressure to this passage again. The 3 Confederation leaders looked at each other. Who are you? The older of the 2 men said. She reached into the writing cloak and produced the covenant document. She unfolded it in the torchlight and let them read it. She watched their faces move through the particular sequence of a person encountering something that shouldn't exist but demonstrably does. Confusion, then reevaluation, then a careful recalibration of what the night has become. Vael, Liel said. Yes. That house is dissolved. The record says so. Soralia held her gaze. The record was negotiated to say so, by 2 empires that had reason to want it to say so. The actual bloodline was not dissolved. I am what remains of it, and the covenant embedded in the original imperial compact still stands, and if you witness my invocation of it tonight, you will have legal standing in the arbitration framework that follows. What does standing mean practically? The older man said. It means your confederation gets a seat at the territorial review that determines who controls this passage and under what terms for the next century, she said. Instead of waiting for Kaelor or Morvain to negotiate between themselves and inform you of the outcome. The 3 of them were quiet. This was the moment where the calculation happened. She could see it moving through their expressions, the rapid and practiced assessment of risk versus opportunity that serious merchants performed with the same efficiency that soldiers assessed terrain. She had known, in the abstract, that this would be the moment. She had not known, until she was standing in it, how completely the outcome depended on factors she could not control, including how much these specific people wanted something different from the empires that had been pressuring them, and how much they trusted the word of a woman who had arrived in a riding cloak in the pre-dawn dark, claiming a bloodline that every official record said was gone. Liel said, "What do you need from us?" She exhaled slowly. "Witnesses," she said. "Legal testimony, formally recorded to the declaration I'm about to make." "And after?" "After," Soralia said. "I need to disappear from this passage before Kaelor moves on it, which they will when the checkpoint commander reports the inspection irregularity." She looked at Liel steadily. "I need the Confederation's underground routes." Liel looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The things we do for a seat at a decent table." And they began. The invocation took 11 minutes. It was not dramatic. Legal processes rarely were. They were precise and deliberate and profoundly undramatic, which was exactly what gave them their authority. She read from the covenant document in the archaic dialect, formally and completely, while Liel and her 2 colleagues witnessed and the Confederation's record keeper transcribed. She produced the pendant as physical evidence of bloodline connection. She stated her name, her full name, the name her mother had never used, that she herself had never spoken aloud, that existed in no imperial record currently accessible to anyone searching for her. Soralia Vael. The words felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong. Strange the way anything feels strange when you have never said it and it turns out to be yours. When it was done, Liel's record keeper sealed the transcription, and Liel said, "It's done. As far as the Confederation is concerned, the covenant is active and witnessed." "Thank you," Soralia said. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when the arbitration framework actually opens and we still have a passage to trade through." She was turning toward Fen when the camp changed. It happened the way danger always happened when she thought about it afterward. Not with the dramatic announcement of obvious threat, but with the accumulation of small wrongnesses that her body registered before her mind articulated them. The particular silence that replaced the camp's ambient noise, the way Fen had gone very still 15 feet away. The way 2 of the 6 riders had shifted their positions without visible reason, moving to flanking points around her. She stopped. The man who stepped out of the shadows at the passage entrance was not a soldier. He was dressed in northern merchant clothing, which was either genuine or the most effective disguise she had seen tonight, and he was perhaps 45 and unremarkable in his physical construction, which was itself a kind of remark. Men who were unremarkable by design had usually worked at it. He stopped 10 feet from her. He was not alone. She could feel the positions of others in the dark, not see them, not hear them, but feel the quality of their presence in the way the shadows organized themselves at the passage walls. "Saralia Vael," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had rehearsed this sentence. She stood still. "You've just invoked the covenant," he said, "on behalf of the House of Vael, before legal witnesses." "Yes," she said, "as we anticipated." The 2 words landed with the specific weight of a door closing on a room she had thought she was navigating freely. She processed everything she needed to process about those words in approximately 4 seconds. The third party, the ones who had positioned her, tended her like a seed, sent the box at the precise moment of maximum instability, placed a rider inside Zevran's camp before Zevran had decided to bring her there. They had anticipated the invocation. They had anticipated this passage, this night, this moment. Every step she had taken in the past 6 hours, every choice she had made with the clarity of a woman who had stopped being careful and started being decisive, had been the step they needed her to take. She had not escaped tonight's engineering. She had completed it. "You need me to have invoked it," she said. "Yes." Because the arbitration cannot be triggered by anyone else. The 7th seat, the Vael seat, is the chair. Without it, the other 6 seats have no governing authority and the framework cannot convene. Correct. And now that I've invoked it, the arbitration must convene. It's entered in Confederation record. It's legally irrevocable. Also correct. She looked at him. This was the thing about betrayal that no one who hadn't experienced its architectural version fully understood. It was not primarily an emotional event. It was a cognitive one. The specific experience of discovering that the map you have been navigating was drawn by someone else for their purposes was not heartbreak, not at its core. It was the sensation of the ground beneath your reasoning becoming temporarily unreliable, the necessity of rebuilding your operational understanding of the situation from the most basic confirmed facts upward, while someone watched you do it and waited. She had been maneuvered, completely and specifically and with extraordinary patience. The only question that mattered now, was by whom and toward what specific outcome, and whether the outcome was something she could live inside or something she needed to destroy. "Who are you?" she said. "My name isn't relevant to your situation. Everything is relevant to my situation." He tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. "We are the people who have been ensuring that the covenant survived long enough to be invoked," he said. "We protected your mother. We protected you at several removes in ways you were never aware of. We positioned this night because the political conditions required a specific convergence: Kaler's public weakness, Morvain's territorial pressure, your availability, and tonight provided all 3 simultaneously. You engineered my severance ceremony." A pause. "We provided Draven with the intelligence about the Thorn Alliance's military value," he said. "We did not control his choices. He made them." The distinction was technically accurate and practically meaningless, and she suspected he knew she knew that. "And Zevran," she said. The pause was fractionally longer this time. "Zevran Morvan has been researching the Vael documentation for 2 years because we allowed certain records to become available to him," the man said. "His territorial interests in the corridor arbitration are genuine. His presence tonight was partly our design, partly his own." She thought about Zevran, saying not all of it. She thought about what he had actually known versus what she had assumed he'd known, and she recalibrated that entire conversation with the new coordinate, and the map shifted in ways that produced equal parts vindication and something she was not quite ready to name. "What do you want from the arbitration?" she said. "What we've always wanted. A governance framework for the corridor territories that isn't controlled by either empire. Neutral administration, the kind that can only exist if the Vale seat is occupied by someone capable of holding it. Someone you position to invoke it. Yes. And if I refuse to chair the arbitration?" He looked at her steadily. "The invocation is recorded," he said. "The arbitration framework is legally active. You can refuse to chair it. The 7th seat will sit empty and the other 6 seats cannot convene and nothing will change, except that you will have invoked a legal instrument that both empires now have reason to be aware of, with your name attached to it, without the protection of the arbitration structure itself. Kaelor will come for the document. Morvain will come for the leverage. And whoever they send will not be interested in the legal distinctions." She looked at him. He was telling her the truth. She hated that he was telling her the truth, because it was the specific truth that left her no clean exits, only the exit they had built for her, which led precisely where they needed her to go. This was the brutal philosophy at the core of the deepest power plays. You did not cage the piece you needed to move freely. You designed the board so that every square the piece could reach led toward the same destination. The piece believed it was navigating. It was, in the narrower sense. But the navigation itself was the mechanism. She had been the piece. She understood that now with complete cold clarity. The question she arrived at, the one that sat underneath the anger and underneath the structural analysis and underneath the specific exhaustion of a woman who had begun this night standing on a dais in ivory and ash blossoms and had somehow arrived here, was a simpler question than any of the political ones. Was the thing they were maneuvering her toward something she actually wanted? She thought about the covenant document in her hand. She thought about the 7th seat. She thought about the Confederation Masters witnessing an invocation, about trade corridors under neutral administration, about 2 empires that had spent 40 years agreeing to erase a bloodline rather than accept the accountability that bloodline's legal standing would require. She thought about Draven filing a petition 6 weeks ago. She thought about what it meant to build a cage sophisticated enough that the person inside it could not distinguish the bars from the architecture. And then she thought about what her mother had done. Her mother had worn the pendant under her collar and changed her name and been careful for 20 years. She had protected the secret. She had done everything asked of her except the one thing that would have made the protection unnecessary. And she had died with it still hidden, still silent, still waiting for a moment that she never allowed herself to believe she was entitled to inhabit. Soralia had watched that carefulness for 9 years and absorbed it without knowing it, and deployed it for 3 more years inside Kaelor's court until Draven had made the carefulness, finally, definitively, completely pointless. She looked at the man in front of her. "The arbitration chair has independent authority," she said. "That's written into the framework." "Yes. Independent, not advisory, not supervisory. The 7th seat is not a figurehead. It was never designed to be." "Then whoever is in that seat chairs the proceedings on their own terms, sets the agenda, determines the review sequence, decides which territorial claims are examined in what order. Within the framework's procedural guidelines, yes. And the framework was written 70 years ago by a house that no longer exists and therefore cannot retroactively restrict how I interpret its provisions." A silence. The man was looking at her with an expression that was experiencing some recalibration of its own. "Yes," he said carefully. "Then here is what you need to understand." She looked at him with the specific quality of attention she had been developing for 3 years in rooms designed to make her feel like furniture. "I will chair the arbitration, not because you maneuvered me into it, not because the document in my hand leaves me no other viable option, but because the territories you're describing deserve a framework that doesn't answer to either empire, and because my mother spent 20 years protecting a covenant she never got to use, and because I have spent 3 years building skills in service of a house that treated me as strategic inventory, and I would like for once to apply those skills in service of something that was actually mine to begin with." She held his gaze. "But I will not be the mechanism you designed me to be. I will be the chair. My terms, my sequence, my agenda. If the outcome serves your interests, that will be incidental. If it doesn't, that will also be incidental. The arbitration will serve the territorial framework as written, and I will interpret that framework as I see fit. And anyone who attempts to manage the process from outside the structure, including you and whoever sent you, will find themselves in front of the sixth seat explaining why they spent 40 years engineering a legal instrument's invocation instead of simply making their case to the relevant authorities. The camp was profoundly silent. Somewhere in the darkness behind the man, she could feel the positions of his colleagues shifting, reassessing. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would have done this." It was not a compliment and not an accusation. It was simply what it was. An observation from someone who had known her mother, or known of her mother, or known the version of her mother that existed in a 40-year operation designed around the woman's bloodline. She did not respond to it. It was not a sentence that required response. "The arbitration will need a location," he said. "Neutral territory." "I'll determine that." "Security?" "I'll determine that as well." He was quiet for a moment, then he inclined his head. She turned to Fen. "The underground routes," she said. "Ready," Fen said. She turned back to the man. "I need 24 hours before either empire knows the arbitration is active," she said. "If Kaelor or Morvain learns about the invocation before I'm in a defensible position, the arbitration doesn't happen, which serves nobody. Can you hold that?" A pause. "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily one more time. "If you're lying to me," she said, "I will dissolve the framework rather than convene it, and I will publish the covenant documentation to every provincial lord and merchant confederation in the Eastern Territories simultaneously, and neither empire will be able to close that box afterward. Both your 40-year project and every territorial relationship that currently functions will be genuinely unrecoverable." He understood her. She saw it in the quality of his stillness, the recognition of a threat that was real, from a person who had demonstrated tonight that she was capable of executing it. 24 hours, he said. She walked past him toward the passage entrance. Behind her, she heard Liel say, quietly, to no one in particular, "I genuinely did not see that coming." Fen fell in beside her. They moved into the passage's darkness, the stone walls rising on both sides, the wind constant at that low breathing frequency, and ahead of them, the underground route that would take her somewhere she had not yet determined, but that would need to be defensible and neutral, and far enough from both empires' immediate reach to buy her the time she needed. She pressed her hand briefly against the pennant through the riding cloak. Her mother had been careful for 20 years. She had been careful for 3. Tonight she had invoked a covenant, walked through a military checkpoint on a protocol that didn't exist, made an agreement with a man whose name she didn't know, and threatened to detonate 40 years of political infrastructure as a negotiating position. She was beginning to understand that careful in her were not a sustainable arrangement. The passage walls closed around her and the wind moved through them, and somewhere behind her, in a palace, in a military camp, in the gathering pre-dawn that would bring Draven's riders to the checkpoint and Zevran's assessment of the empty camp and the third party's careful calculation of whether she would hold to what she'd said. The world was rearranging itself around a legal document that had spent 7 decades waiting to matter. She walked deeper into the darkness. She walked like a woman who had finally stopped waiting to be told she was allowed. And inside the passage walls, where the sound carried differently, where the constant wind made everything slightly louder than it should have been, she thought she heard, the faint sound of riders at the passage entrance behind her. Not the man's people, not the Confederation. The particular rhythm of military horses, hard-ridden, and voices calling clearance at the blocked barrier, and a name, her name, being demanded in a voice she recognized. Not Draven. Worse. The voice was Zevran's, and it was not the voice of a man who had received information and was approaching with strategy. It was the voice of a man who had received information that had stripped strategy out of him entirely and replaced it with something raw and more dangerous and far less predictable. She stopped walking. Listened. The wind in the passage walls gave her fragments. She heard her name again. She heard a Kaelor soldier's voice responding. Not her checkpoint captain, a different voice, already reporting. She heard what the soldier was reporting. She stood very still in the darkness between the passage walls. Because what the soldier was reporting to Zevran Morvain was that 20 minutes ago a Kaelor dispatch rider had come through the checkpoint, not from the palace, from the northern provincial garrison, with a message bearing Draven's personal seal and marked emergency priority. And Soralia understood before the next fragment reached her. She understood with the full, cold, clarifying weight of someone who has been outmaneuvered by the variable they forgot to model, that the man behind her, the one she had called the third party's representative, had given her 24 hours and had been entirely sincere about it. The problem was that Draven had not needed 24 hours. Draven had been moving since the moment she left the palace. Not toward her, toward the Covenant. He had known about Vielle. He had always known. The 6-week petition, the staged ceremony, the strategic choreography of the entire night. It had not been about the Thorn Alliance's military value. It had been about getting her out of the palace, into the open, where the Covenant could be invoked, and where its invocation could be witnessed by exactly the people he needed to witness it, under circumstances that would make the arbitration's convening appear coerced, appear politically motivated, appear illegitimate under the specific provision of the original framework that she had not, in 3 hours of analysis, had time to locate. The provision that required the invoking heir to be acting freely, without duress, without political arrangement. She had invoked it in the company of Zevran Morvaine's riders, after walking out of Zevran Morvaine's military camp, following a public severance ceremony that Draven had engineered. And the dispatch rider's message, she could hear Zevran reading it now, his voice stripped of its usual control, formally contested the Covenant invocation on the grounds of political coercion and demanded the arbitration framework be suspended pending a legitimacy review. A review that Draven, as Kaelor's sovereign, had the legal standing to demand. A review that would take 6 months, during which she would have no legal standing, no arbitration protection, no framework authority, and Draven's full institutional force arrayed against the validity of everything she had just done. She stood in the passage darkness and understood, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to discover that the board you thought you were playing had a second board beneath it, and that she was not the piece. She had never been the piece. She was the game, and the game was nowhere near finished. She had approximately 40 seconds before Zevran cleared the checkpoint barrier. She knew this not from calculation but from the sound of his voice, the specific quality of controlled urgency in it, the way he was speaking to the garrison soldiers with enough authority to move them without triggering a defensive response. He was getting through the gate. He was doing it efficiently. 40 seconds was generous. She started moving, not running. Running in a stone passage with uneven ground in the dark was how ankles broke, and ankles were not something she could afford to break tonight. Moving fast, controlled, with the specific economy of motion that came from understanding that speed without direction was just a faster way to go the wrong place. Fen. Her voice was low. Fen was already beside her. The woman had been tracking the sounds from the checkpoint the same way Soralia had. She could tell from the way Fen's body had already shifted toward forward movement before Soralia spoke. Underground access is 60 meters ahead on the left wall, Fen said. Stone marker at knee height. Looks like the passage bedrock. How many of our riders know where it leads? 2. The others follow. Then put the 2 who know it front and back. Soralia kept moving. If we separate, the 2 who know the route take whoever is with them to the secondary exit and wait 48 hours. If nobody comes, they go north. Understood. Go. Fen went. Soralia followed at the pace she had determined was the maximum she could sustain without noise or injury, and she counted her steps the way she had been counting resources all night. Not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the cold precision of a woman who had learned that information was the only currency that retained its value when everything else was gone. Behind her, the checkpoint barrier opened with the sound of stressed metal. She did not look back. The stone marker appeared in the darkness at the location Fen had described. Waist height, not knee height, which meant Fen navigated by her own body proportions, and Soralia's were different, which was the kind of small mismatch that killed people in situations less dangerous than this one. She filed the information for future use and followed the lead rider through the gap in the passage wall that turned out to be neither gap nor door, but a seam in the stone so precisely fitted that it was invisible until you were standing against it. Knowing what to look for, with a hand pressed flat against the surface at exactly the right angle. The passage inside was not a tunnel. It was more like the stone had simply failed to close completely. A vertical crack, barely wide enough for a person sideways, that descended at an angle she had not anticipated and could not fully assess in the dark. She went in anyway, The cold in the stone crack was different from the passage cold, concentrated, pressured, smelling of deep earth and old water and time, measured in geological rather than political units. The walls were close enough on both sides that she could feel them through her cloak without extending her arms. She moved sideways, angled downward, hands finding the walls automatically for orientation, and behind her she heard the soft controlled sounds of 5 other bodies doing the same. She heard Zevran's voice enter the passage, not words. The acoustic character of the passage carried tone but not language at this distance, and what she heard was the tone of a man who had arrived somewhere and found it wrong and was recalculating without the luxury of time. She had heard that tone before, on Draven more than once, in council sessions when the intelligence didn't match the operational reality. On Zevran, once, when the dispatch rider's message had stripped the strategy out of his voice. It was the sound of a highly capable person confronting the gap between their model and the territory. She kept moving. The angled descent leveled after approximately 30 feet, and then the crack widened into something she could move through without sideways compression. A low passage, rough-hewn rather than naturally formed, with the marks of old tools visible in the stone walls where the torchlight from the lead rider's small lamp caught them at the right angle. Someone had built this. Not recently. The tool marks were old enough to predate the passage itself as an active trade route, which put their origin at least a century back, probably more. She thought about people a century ago cutting stone passages for reasons they would never explain to the people who came after them. She thought about her mother hiding a pendant for 20 years. She thought about a house erased from official record while its bloodline quietly continued in a provincial town with a changed name and careful habits. She thought about how much of human history was the construction of exits that nobody was supposed to know about. Then she stopped thinking about anything but the ground under her feet and the distance she needed to cover. The passage ran for what she estimated was a quarter mile before it changed character again. The ceiling rising, the floor leveling, the air losing the deep earth concentration and gaining something closer to outside cold. She could feel the change in pressure. The exit was close. The lead rider stopped. Soralia came up beside him, a man of perhaps 45, broad through the shoulders, with the deliberate physical economy of someone who had spent long periods in confined spaces and understood that unnecessary movement was a liability. He pointed upward. She followed the gesture and saw, above a short vertical climb, a rectangle of darkness that was marginally less dark than the stone around it. Dawn approaching. They were coming out on the north face of the ridge. She could tell from the temperature differential and the smell. Cold coming from above rather than from the stone walls, clean and direct. Northern exposure, which put them on the far side of the passage from where Zevran had entered, and on the near side to the terrain that Fenn's mental map of the corridor territory was built on. She climbed. The vertical section was 12 feet of carved handholds in the stone face, cold enough that her fingers registered the grip as pain rather than simple sensation. She climbed through the pain the way she had learned to move through discomfort tonight, as information, acknowledged, and set aside, because the body that was providing the information still needed to keep performing while the information was being processed. She came out onto a flat ledge on the north face with gray pre-dawn sky above her, and the ridge descending steeply below into a valley that was still in full dark. She stood there for 4 seconds, just 4, and looked at the sky and breathed. Then she turned and helped the next rider up. They were 6 on the ledge when Fenn came up last and pulled the exit stone back into position behind her. It seated with the soft, specific sound of a thing designed to be invisible. Soralia looked at the sealed stone and then at the valley below and then at Fenn. "Where does the valley lead?" she said. "Secondary merchant way station, 3 miles, Confederation aligned. Nobody from either empire has jurisdiction there." "That's where we're going." "Yes. Move." They moved. The descent was steep enough that she was using her hands as well as her feet for the first section, cloak gathered and tied off to keep it from tangling, pendant pressing against her sternum, with each forward lean in a way that had moved from awareness to simple physical fact over the past hours. She was going to have bruises along her collarbone by morning. That seemed appropriate. Behind her on the passage side of the ridge, she could hear nothing. The stone absorbed sound comprehensively. Zevran might be 20 feet away on the other side of that ridge, or he might be back at the checkpoint organizing a systematic search of the corridor perimeter, or he might be... She allowed this possibility without emotional weight because it was a real variable, already ahead of her, knowing routes she hadn't mapped. He had known routes she hadn't mapped before. All night he had known things she didn't. The fair accounting of the night required her to hold that fact accurately. The way station appeared at the bottom of the valley as a collection of low structures, stone and heavy timber, built into the terrain rather than placed on top of it, with the particular permanence of buildings that were designed to endure seasons rather than impress visitors. Confederation flags at the entrance, worn from weather, lamps burning inside, visible through window gaps, horses in a covered line, the sounds of people awake before full dawn, which meant traders. Traders ran on different schedules than soldiers, oriented toward markets rather than military rhythms. She walked through the way station entrance like she had every reason to be there. The trader at the entrance desk looked up from his ledger. She placed the covenant document in front of him without preamble. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the 6 riders behind her. Confederation Safe Passage, she said. Authorized by Liel, Confederation Master, Velhari Passage, tonight. I need a private room and access to your message courier for 1 hour. He read the document's seal. He had read it before. She could tell from the way his eyes went directly to the veil marking rather than scanning the whole seal. He knew what this mark was, which meant the Confederation had been briefed or had their own documentation or had been waiting for exactly this seal to appear at exactly this type of station. Another layer she hadn't seen yet. She was beginning to understand that the 40-year architecture had significantly more layers than she had initially estimated. Room 3, he said. Courier is Tam. She's already here. Already here. She absorbed that without visible reaction and followed his directions to room 3, which was small and stone-walled and contained a lamp, a table, 2 chairs, and a young woman of perhaps 20 sitting in one of the chairs with a message satchel across her lap and the specific patient alertness of someone who had been told to wait and was waiting without expectation of explanation. Tam, already here. Who sent you? Soralia said. Confederation Master Liel, Tam said. She sent me ahead of you. How far ahead? 2 hours. Soralia pulled out the second chair and sat down across from her. She looked at Tam's face carefully. Young, competent, no visible anxiety, which was either genuine steadiness or very good training. Both were possible. Both were concerning in different ways. Liel sent you before I invoked the covenant, she said. Tam did not answer. She sent you before I arrived at the passage, Soralia said. Before she knew I would invoke it. Before she knew the night would go the way it went. Silence. Liel knew I was coming to the passage, Soralia said. Tam folded her hands on the satchel. The Confederation has been advised of tonight's likely developments for 3 weeks, she said carefully. I was positioned here as a contingency resource. 3 weeks. The Morvain camp had been established 3 weeks ago. She sat with the full geometry of that for a moment. Every player in tonight's sequence had been positioned 3 weeks ago. Zevran's forward camp. The Confederation's contingency courier. The rider in the camp with the lacquered box. Every piece on the board had been placed before the game officially started, and the starting moment, Shasache, the severance ceremony, the public spectacle, that had been the signal, not the origin. She was very tired, not physically. She had moved past physical tired into the territory that lived on the other side of it, where the body runs on something older and more reliable than energy. She was tired in the specific way that came from sustained betrayal processing, from the continuous revision of understanding that the night had required of her, from the accumulated weight of discovering, again and again, that the room she was standing in was smaller than she had thought and had been built by someone else. She thought about what she had said in the passage to the man she did not know. I will not be the mechanism you designed me to be. She meant it. She still meant it. But meaning something and having the operational capacity to execute it were 2 different things, and her operational capacity at the current moment included 1 small stone room, 6 riders, a Confederation courier who had been positioned before she arrived, a legal document whose validity was currently being contested by Imperial Dispatch, a pennant that proved a bloodline nobody was supposed to know existed, and approximately 4 hours before full daylight made her position in this valley visible to anyone looking from the ridge. She opened the message satchel that Tam had placed on the table. Inside was a single folded document. Lael's handwriting. She read it. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to the door and said to Fen, who was standing in the corridor with the specific posture of someone actively monitoring, "Get me a horse. One of yours, not the Confederation stock. And get me the rider, the one from Zevran's camp who brought the box. You said you were looking for him." Fen looked at her. "We found him," Fen said, 20 minutes ago. He was at the checkpoint when we came through. He'd presented himself to the garrison captain voluntarily." Soralia went very still. "He presented himself?" "Yes." "Voluntarily?" "Yes." "What did he say to the garrison captain?" Fen's expression shifted fractionally. Not alarm. The specific quality of a person deciding how to deliver information that changes the situation significantly. "He said he had evidence that the Covenant invocation was coerced," Fen said. "He said he was prepared to testify to it." The room moved around her slightly. Not physically. The way rooms moved when the ground beneath a situation shifted and the walls maintained their positions, but their relationship to each other changed. He had been inside Zevran's camp. He had delivered the box. He had watched her invoke the Covenant. And now he was voluntarily providing testimony to support Draven's legal challenge. She thought about this with everything she had. She thought about how the man in the passage had said, "We protected you," at several removes in ways you were never aware of. She thought about how Zevran had said, "Not all of it." She thought about how every actor tonight had been positioned 3 weeks ago, and she had been the only one arriving without preparation. She looked at Fen. "Zevran," she said, "where is he now?" "On the passage side of the ridge, based on last sound. He's conducting a sweep. He'll find the exit point. Eventually." "How long?" Fen considered. "An hour? Maybe less?" She looked at the pendant against her collarbone. She looked at the Covenant document. She looked at Liel's letter on the table, the letter that had been here waiting for her, that had told her 3 things she had not known, the last of which was the one she was still processing, the last of which was the name of the person who had been running the 40-year operation. Not a faction, not a house, a name she knew, a name she had last seen on a Kalor Council document 4 months ago, attached to a financial analysis of the Velhari Corridor's strategic value, authored by a member of Draven's inner advisory circle. A name that, when she reconstructed the night from the beginning with this new coordinate, made every decision by every actor make a different kind of sense. Draven had not built tonight, but someone standing very close to Draven had built it, and had used Draven's ambitions and his blindness to the variable of Soralia's actual capabilities as the primary mechanism of construction, and had done it so cleanly that Draven himself probably did not know the extent of what he had been operating inside. She walked back into the room. She picked up Liel's letter. She looked at the name. Then she made the decision that the night had been building toward, not the decision the architect of the night had intended, but the one she had been building toward in the 3 seconds between Draven's first sentence and the smoke of the dying soul mark, in the 6 hours since, in the 40 years before she was born. She looked at Tam. "I need the courier route to the Kalor Palace," she said. Tam blinked. "Not to send a message," Soralia said. "To intercept one." There was a specific kind of decision that human beings made when they had been stripped of every protection and every institutional structure and every relationship they had believed was load-bearing. History recorded it imperfectly because the people who made it rarely survived to describe it accurately from the inside. But the record was consistent in one thing. Those decisions were never made from desperation. They were made from the specific clarity that only arrived when desperation had burned through completely and left nothing behind but the actual truth of a person's capabilities and commitments. She was in that clarity now. And the truth it revealed was not comfortable. She was not a council advisor. She was not a consort. She was not a piece in a game she had not been told was being played. She was the 7th seat of an arbitration framework that 2 empires had spent 40 years trying to prevent from convening, and she was in possession of documentation proving it. And she was the only person in the current situation who understood the complete geometry of the board because she was the only person who had received accurate information from every player rather than the partial information each player had curated for their own purposes. That was her edge, and she was going to use it the way she had learned to use every resource tonight, completely, without sentimentality, for as long as it held. "Fen," she said. Fen appeared in the doorway. "I need you to go back," Soralia said. A beat. "To the passage," Fen said. "To Zevran." Another beat. "And tell him what?" Fen said. "Tell him I know the name," she said. "He'll understand." Fen looked at her steadily. She was running some version of the loyalty calculation, not to Zevran specifically, Soralia thought, but to her own read of the situation, her own assessment of whether this instruction made strategic sense. "You're sending me back into a corridor that has Kaelor garrison presence and Zevran actively sweeping it," Fen said. "Yes." "While you stay here?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because Zevran's going to find the exit point," she said. "He's going to come through it. And when he arrives here, he needs to know I'm not running from him. I'm ahead of him. Those are different things, and he needs to understand the difference before he arrives, or this goes wrong in ways that are difficult to recover from." Fen looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor without further comment. Soralia looked at Tam. "The name on this letter," she said. "How long has the Confederation known it?" Tam folded her hands. 6 months, she said. "And Liel told me tonight because once the invocation was made, the operation was complete enough that concealing it no longer served anyone's interests." A pause. "And because Liel thought you deserved to know who built the cage." She absorbed that. "Does Zevran know the name?" she said. Tam's answer was its own kind of information. She said nothing. Which meant, yes, Zevran knew. Had known. Which meant when she had asked him to be the distraction, and he had agreed, and when he had been moving through the passage with genuine urgency in his voice, he had been doing both things simultaneously, being the distraction, and coming for her. And those were not in conflict because the thing he was protecting her from and the thing he was racing toward were the same thing. She thought about what it meant to operate with partial information while someone you weren't certain about operated with more. She thought about whether that made him dangerous or simply a person running multiple objectives the way every person in power ran multiple objectives. And she thought about whether she could distinguish between those two things based on available data. And she concluded, with the calm that lived on the other side of exhaustion, that she could not determine this from inside the room. She needed him in front of her. She needed to ask him directly and watch him answer without preparation time, which was the only diagnostic tool she had that she trusted. She waited. It took 43 minutes. She knew because she had been counting time the way she had been counting everything tonight. Not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the cold accuracy of a woman for whom information was the only remaining form of control she fully possessed. He came through the Shui station entrance at a pace that was not quite running, but was one notch below it. And when he appeared in the doorway of room 3, the lamplight showed her things about his face that the torchlight of the camp and the darkness of the passage had not. He looked like a man who had been moving hard for an hour through difficult terrain and had not permitted himself to stop. His riding coat had stone dust on the sleeve from the passage walls. There was a cut along his jaw that was fresh and shallow, the kind a sharp edge of stone produced when you moved through a confined space faster than the space was designed for. He had come through the exit crack at speed. He looked at her sitting at the table in the lamplight, and the quality of his expression in that moment was not something she could easily categorize. It was not relief, exactly. It was the expression of a person who has arrived at a location they needed to reach, and is still in the process of integrating the fact of having reached it. He said nothing for a moment. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She put Liel's letter on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at the name. He looked at her. "You know?" he said. "Yes." "How long?" 40 minutes, she said. "You?" "Longer." She looked at him steadily. "How much longer?" she said. He put both hands flat on the table, not aggressive, the gesture of a person organizing themselves for honesty rather than for strategy. 2 months, he said. "I identified the name 2 months ago." I didn't know the full scope. I didn't know the 40-year timeline or your bloodline or the extent of the operation. I knew the name was running something that intersected with the Velhari situation and had assets inside both empires. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know you. You knew me enough to walk into Kaelor's ceremony. I knew of you, he said. That's different. I knew your council record. I knew your analytical work. I didn't know what you would do when everything fell apart. A pause. I know now. She held his gaze. What do you know now? She said. He looked at the letter. I know that you invoked a covenant under circumstances designed to compromise its validity, and instead of retreating, you went deeper into the problem, and that you sent Fen back to me specifically so I would understand your movement before I arrived, rather than after. He met her eyes. I know you're not running. I know you understand the complete geometry of this better than anyone else in the current situation. And I know that the person who built tonight's architecture is going to discover in the next few hours that the mechanism they designed has developed its own intentions. She looked at the name on the letter. Counselor Andrav Mael, Draven's senior strategic advisor. The man who had sat across from her in 47 council sessions and asked thoughtful questions and incorporated her analysis into his recommendations with what she had taken for genuine collegial respect. The man who had been running a 40-year operation to install a Veil heir in the arbitration chair using both empires as instruments, having spent 2 decades positioning himself close enough to Kaelor's sovereign to ensure that when the moment arrived, Draven's actions would serve the operation rather than threaten it. He had not built the severance ceremony. He had simply made sure that when Draven's ambitions led him there, the timing was right. That was the coldest kind of manipulation. The kind that didn't require you to move the pieces directly. It required you to understand the pieces well enough that their own nature moved them to the positions you needed. She thought about 47 council sessions. She thought about 47 sessions of giving her best thinking to a man who was using it to map her capabilities for a purpose she had never agreed to serve. The anger that arrived was not hot. It was the cold variety. The kind that did not burn itself out but sustained at a consistent temperature and made thinking clearer rather than cloudier. She had always found this about herself. That genuine anger improved her cognition rather than degrading it. It was fear that made her slow. Anger made her precise. The legitimacy challenge, she said. Draven filed it based on Mael's advice, Zevran said. The dispatch writer we intercepted, the one who volunteered to testify, he's Mael's asset, not Draven's. Draven doesn't know. Draven knows he wants the challenge filed. He doesn't know the asset isn't loyal to him. She looked at the table. If Mael's testimony collapses the legitimacy challenge, she said, the invocation stands, the arbitration convenes, under my chair. Yes. Mael needs the arbitration to convene. Yes. So he filed the challenge to create the appearance of contested invocation, which makes the eventual validation of it look more legitimate. He turned Draven's own counter-move into a setup for the arbitration's credibility. Zevran looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. She stood up. The specific moment when a person understands that they have been inside a construct so comprehensive it accounted for their resistance, including the resistance she had demonstrated in the passage, including the declaration she had made about running the arbitration on her own terms, was not a moment that produced despair. Not in people constituted the way she was constituted. It produced the specific challenge of a very difficult problem, which was, find the one element the architect did not account for. Because no construct was perfect. No 40-year operation ran without assumptions. And assumptions made about a person who had never been in this position before, who had never been tested at this level, who had spent 3 years being careful and had only tonight stopped being careful. Those assumptions were built on models that were already obsolete. She looked at Zevran. He accounted for me invoking the covenant, she said. Yes. He accounted for Draven challenging it. Yes. He accounted for the challenge failing and the arbitration convening. Yes. Did he account for me convening it wrong? A silence. Wrong, Zevran said. The framework has 7 seats, 6 geographic territories, and the Veil chair. The framework requires all 7 to convene. Any fewer, and the arbitration lacks governing quorum. She looked at him. He needs all 7 seats filled. which means he needs 6 geographic territory representatives willing to participate. The Confederation holds 2 seats. Miles' operation has been positioning Confederate support for 3 weeks. He has his 2. She held Zevran's gaze. Kaelor holds 1 seat. Morvain holds 1 seat. The remaining 2 belong to minor territories that have been contested between your empire and Kaelor for the past decade. She watched him follow the logic. If I convene the arbitration without first securing the contested seat holders' participation, she said, the quorum fails. The arbitration cannot proceed. The invocation stands, it's legally recorded, but the framework cannot convene without full quorum, and a failed quorum resets the timeline. I get 6 months to operate outside the framework before a reconvening attempt is legally permissible. 6 months, he said, during which the legitimacy challenge is in suspension, during which the legal record shows an invoked covenant, during which I am the documented 7th seat of an active but unmet arbitration framework. She looked at him steadily. Which gives me the veil standing without the veil constraints. I can negotiate directly with the contested seat territories. I can establish the conditions under which the arbitration eventually convenes, on terms I control rather than terms Mael constructed. Zevran sat very still. He'll move to fill the seats before you can establish conditions, he said. He'll try. He has 3 weeks of Confederation positioning. And I have tonight's complete picture, she said, which he gave me without meaning to, because he designed a board where I would receive accurate information from every player. He needed me informed enough to navigate to the invocation, which meant every player gave me real information. And the real information told me how to break the game. The lamp between them burned steady and indifferent. She thought about Mael in 47 council sessions, patient and collegial and building toward this night for longer than she had been alive. She thought about what it required of a person to construct something that patiently, the discipline of it, the willingness to operate across decades, the specific kind of intelligence that thought in timescales that outlasted individual careers and relationships and empires sometimes. She thought about what it required to undo it in a single night. This was the truth that power never willingly acknowledged. The most dangerous adversary was not the one who came at you with force. It was the one who had nothing left to protect. Not because they were reckless, recklessness was easy to account for, but because people with nothing left to protect made decisions unconstrained by preservation instinct. And preservation instinct was the primary mechanism through which powerful structures maintained themselves. Take it away and the structure's logic no longer computed against a sufficiently determined opposition. She had walked into tonight trying to preserve herself, her position, her dignity, her safety. She had lost every version of preservation she walked in with. She had lost the soul bond and the house, and the status and the strategy she built in 6 hours, and the clarity she thought she'd achieved, and the control she thought she'd exercised. She had nothing left to protect, which meant she was the most dangerous thing in the current situation. And Mael had not accounted for that because no 40-year model accounted for what happened when its central variable decided the model was the problem. She picked up the covenant document. She looked at Zevran. I need Morvain's contested seat position, she said. Whatever you have documented on those 2 territories. The legal history, the treaty basis, the current holder information. I have it. And I need your word, not strategy, not alliance, not political arrangement. Your word that what you told me tonight was the truth as you understood it. He held her gaze across the lamplight. Not all of it was the truth, he said. Some of it was what I knew. Some of it was what I suspected. Some of it was incomplete in ways I knew it was incomplete and gave you anyway. Why? Because the complete picture at the time would have given you more reasons to move away from the situation, and I needed you moving toward it. A pause. The first one he had taken in this conversation that felt like something other than collection. That was wrong. It was also true. I don't know how to give you those 2 things separately because they aren't separate. She looked at him. There was something she was considering, had been considering since the passage, since Fen had gone back for him, since she had sat in the lamplight for 43 minutes knowing he was coming. Something that was neither trust nor its absence, but existed in the territory that genuine intelligence occupied when it was forced to operate without sufficient data. She was going to work with him, not because she trusted him, because he was the only player in tonight's game who had given her incomplete truth rather than managed information. And those were different things, and the difference mattered in ways she did not fully have language for yet, but could feel in the quality of every conversation they had had since the bronze doors of the grand hall opened. "Get me the documentation," she said. He stood. He moved toward the door and stopped. He turned back. "Soralia." She looked at him. "The name on that letter," he said. "Mael. He's been inside Kaelor's court for 23 years. He's been inside Draven's trust for 12. When Draven finds out what Mael built, and he will find out, when the legal challenge collapses and someone walks him through the architecture, he'll come for Mael," she said. "He'll come for everything Mael touched," Zevran said, "including every person Mael positioned or used or moved, including the arbitration framework, including you." She looked at the Covenant document in her hand. Outside the way station walls, the pre-dawn had advanced to the specific gray that preceded actual dawn by 20 minutes. She could see it through the window gap, the sky lightening from black to the color of old ash, the first birds making noise in the valley timber, the world recommitting to the project of being visible. In 20 minutes it would be full daylight. In an hour, Draven's garrison reports would reach the palace. In 2 hours, Mael would understand that the quorum strategy was not proceeding as he'd designed. In 3 hours, the contested territory seat holders would receive communication from at least 2 different imperial sources, each offering different versions of what the Velhari arbitration framework represented and what their participation would mean, and the seat holders would have to choose without adequate information, which was exactly the kind of decision that went wrong in ways that were expensive to correct. She had 2 hours. She looked at Zevran. "Then we need to move faster than he can," she said. He nodded once. He walked out of the room. She stood alone with the lamp and the Covenant document and the pendant against her collarbone and the specific weight of a situation that was about to require everything she had learned in 3 years, and everything she had suppressed, and everything she had never been permitted to demonstrate, and everything she had become in the past 6 hours on the far side of the most complete loss of her known life. She thought about Draven standing on the palace steps calling her name. She thought about how she had not returned. She thought about how every step since that moment had carried her further from the person who would have returned. Outside the window, the sky was gray and getting lighter. She heard horses. Not Zevran's. He was still inside the station getting documentation. Not Fenn's. Fenn had sent one signal back through the courier system that meant she was clear and stationary. Different horses. Military rhythm. Coming fast from the south. From the passage direction. From the Kaelor garrison side. They had found the exit point faster than she had calculated, or Bray had checked the charter before she expected, or Mael had moved an asset she hadn't known to account for, or some combination of all three, and it did not matter which because the outcome was identical. Boots on ground in the valley below the way station, and she was standing in a room with a legal document and 6 riders and a northern emperor who was 10 feet away, and the gray light of a day that was about to become irrevocably different from any day that had come before it. She walked to the door. She looked at the 5 riders still in the corridor. She said, "Buy me 15 minutes." And they moved. The sound of them deploying through the way station, coordinated, fast, without question, was a specific kind of sound she had never heard aimed in her direction before. Force moving on her behalf, not Draven's institutional force, not Mael's patient-constructed force, not even Zevran's borrowed force. 6 people who had ridden through the night and the stone crack and the pre-dawn valley and who were now moving to hold a position because she had said hold it. That was different from everything that had come before. She turned back to the table. She picked up the Covenant document. She pressed her hand flat against the pendant through her cloak. She heard Zevran re-enter the corridor and assess the situation in the same beat. Heard him understand from the sound of his rider's deployment exactly what was coming from the south. Heard him make some decision she did not have a reading on yet. Then his voice came from the corridor, quiet and direct. "Soralia, I have the documentation, and I have a route out of the valley that doesn't go through the garrison's approach." She picked up Liel's letter. She looked at the name one more time. She put the letter in the flame of the lamp. She watched it burn. Then she walked out of the room and toward whatever Zevran was about to show her, and behind her the ash of Counselor Mael's exposure drifted upward in the lamplight of a small stone room in a Confederation way station in a valley nobody was supposed to know about. And outside, the sound of military horses reached the valley floor. And inside the way station, the sound of 5 people holding a position for 15 minutes began. And somewhere above them all, the gray sky was 15 minutes from becoming daylight. And in daylight, everything that had been built in the dark would be visible to everyone who had reason to look, and everyone had reason to look. And the question that sat at the center of all of it, the question that would determine whether the Covenant arbitration convened on her terms, or Miles' terms, or no terms at all, was whether 15 minutes was enough. She did not know. She moved anyway. The route Zevran showed her went up. Not down the valley toward the garrison's approach, not sideways along the ridge toward the passage, up, through the timber on the valley's northern face, along a trail so narrow it was less a path than an argument between trees about where a person might walk if they had no better option. She went first. He came behind. Neither spoke. The 15 minutes her riders were buying passed beneath them like ground they had already crossed. She could hear the sounds from the way station below, controlled and professional. Nothing that indicated catastrophe, everything that indicated exactly the kind of deliberate delay she had asked for. 5 people buying time against a garrison unit, while 2 other people climbed a mountain in pre-dawn gray, which was the kind of sentence that sounded absurd until you were inside it, at which point it was simply the next thing requiring your full attention. The timber thinned near the ridge crest. She came out above the valley into the full cold of morning. Real morning now, not pre-dawn gray, but the actual arrival of a sun that was still below the eastern horizon, but had sent its advance light ahead as evidence of intention. The sky was the color of iron before it went red. The valley below them was filling with that light, slowly, the way water fills a basin. From the bottom up, from the low places first. She could see the way station from here, the garrison unit outside it, the specific organized stillness of a military situation that had reached a standoff and was deciding what to do about it. She could see Fen at the edge of the tree line on the valley's eastern side, mounted, with the specific posture of a person waiting for an exact signal. She had not asked Fen to be there. Fen had positioned herself there anyway. She thought about this as she stood on the ridge in the iron-gray morning and felt the cold make contact with every surface it could find. She thought about what it meant when people positioned themselves in your interest without being asked, and whether that was loyalty or whether it was something that didn't have a clean name in the political vocabulary she had been operating in for 3 years. Draven had commanded loyalty. He had structured it, rewarded it, built institutional architecture around it that made it difficult to distinguish from genuine devotion. She had watched it for 3 years and had thought she understood it. She had been loyal herself, had given the house the full weight of her capabilities, had held nothing back, had been more useful than she had ever been given credit for. And she understood now, watching Fen in the tree line below, that she had never been in the same conversation Draven was in. He had been managing compliance. She had been offering something that had no adequate structure in his court to receive it. That was not entirely his failure. Some of it was hers, for not seeing the distinction sooner, for mistaking institutional relationship for genuine one, for spending 3 years being useful to something that could not tell the difference between her usefulness and a well-designed tool. But she was done assigning shares of that particular cost. The accounting was closed. Zevran came up beside her on the ridge. They stood in the iron morning looking at the valley. After a moment he said, "The garrison will hold the way station for 6 hours before they need to report back. Bray won't escalate without direct order from Draven, and Draven's dispatch chain from the palace takes 4 hours on fast horse." 2 hours of operation, she said, more or less. She looked at the valley. She looked at the eastern horizon where the sun was building its arrival with the indifference of something that had been keeping this schedule for an incomprehensible span of time and did not intend to adjust it for the current political situation. "The contested seat territories," she said, "Harev and Solmain." "Yes. Harev has been under Kaelor pressure for 18 months. Their territorial governor filed 3 objections to Draven's corridor policies last year. He was denied each time." "Yes. He needs the arbitration framework to want it genuinely," she said. "Not because Mael positioned him, because it's the only mechanism that gives him independent standing against Kaelor's pressure." "Yes." "And Solmain." Zevran was quiet for a moment. Solmain is harder, he said. Their governor's relationship with Morvaine's territorial management is complicated. He owes you. A pause. He owes my empire several significant financial accommodations, Zevran said, which means he won't participate in anything that looks like it moves against Morvaine's interests. Correct. She thought about this. The sun crested the eastern horizon. It came up red, the specific red of a cold, clear morning, hard and honest, with none of the warmth that sunrise was supposed to carry, just the fact of light arriving and doing the work of visibility without embellishment. It hit the valley first, then the way station walls, then the ridge where they stood, and she felt it on her face as a physical fact with no emotional content, which was exactly right for this moment. If Morvaine formally endorses the arbitration, she said, Solmain reads it as safe to participate. Yes. Which means I need your endorsement before I can convene. Yes. She turned and looked at him directly. The morning light was not kind to the evidence of a hard night. She could see it in his face as clearly as she could feel it in her own body. The specific exhaustion and alertness of someone who had not slept and had moved hard and had been operating at sustained high capacity through multiple reversals of understanding. He looked like what he was, a man who had been at war with the territory for several hours and was still standing. What do you want from the endorsement? She said. Specifically, the numbers. He held her gaze. The 3 northern boundary territories, he said. Kaelor's Pass, the Wren watershed, and the Solmain Eastern Approach. Full territorial review under the arbitration framework with Morvaine's claims given equal standing to Kaelor's. Equal standing, she said, not preferential. Equal, the framework decides. She looked at the valley. She thought about the arbitration chair. She thought about what it meant to hold that seat with genuine independence. Not independence from all interests, which was impossible, but independence from the obligation to serve any single interest as its primary function. Equal standing for all claims. The framework deciding. Herself chairing. The way it was supposed to have worked 70 years ago, before 2 empires decided that a neutral mechanism was more threatening than a contested border. I'll grant the review, she said, under the framework's procedural guidelines. I make no commitment on outcome. I'm not asking for outcome, Set, he said. I'm asking for the hearing. She thought about whether she believed him. She thought about the difference between a man who wanted a hearing and a man who had already calculated that the hearing would produce a favorable outcome and was framing his desire for that outcome in the more palatable language of procedural fairness. She thought about the fact that she could not determine this from available data and that operating in conditions of irreducible uncertainty was the baseline condition of every consequential decision she had ever made or would ever make, and that people who waited for certainty before acting never acted at all and called the paralysis wisdom. Endorsed, she said. He nodded once. She turned toward the ridge descent. There's something else, he said. She stopped. She heard it in his voice. Not strategy. Something underneath strategy, that strategy was usually built to protect. She turned back. He was looking at the valley, not at her. I've been running this empire for 11 years, he said. I have made more decisions that I do not regret in terms of outcome, but do not want to examine too carefully in terms of method than I can count comfortably. I have been strategic when I should have been honest, and have told myself the strategy served the outcome, and the outcome justified the strategy. She waited. Tonight I did that to you, he said, specifically, not as a general operational philosophy, to you. And I want to name it directly, rather than allow it to be a thing we both understand and neither say. She looked at his profile in the morning light. I didn't bring you out of Kaelor's ceremony because of corridor strategy, he said. That was the justification I used to myself for an impulse I had before I had a strategic framework for it. A pause. I walked into that hall because watching someone be publicly destroyed for being strategically inconvenient is something I have a specific and personal response to. My justifications came after. They were real. The strategy is real, but they were not what moved first. She held very still. And I used your situation, he said. I positioned my presence in your worst moment as something you could receive as intervention rather than calculation, and those things were both true simultaneously, and I let you believe they were more simply one than the other. The morning was very quiet on the ridge. She thought about 47 council sessions with a man who had done something similar for 47 times the duration, with far less of this kind of accounting at the end of it. She thought about what it cost a person constituted the way Zevran was constituted to say this. The specific cost, to a man for whom strategic framing was as natural as breathing, of removing the strategic frame deliberately and standing in what was underneath it. She thought about whether this was itself a form of strategy, the most sophisticated version, the one that deployed honesty as the final lever. She thought about the fact that she genuinely could not tell, and she thought about whether that uncertainty was the thing she needed to resolve before she could proceed, or whether proceeding was itself the only resolution available. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I knew in the passage," she said. "When you said not all of it, I knew there was something underneath the strategy that you were keeping inside the strategy." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't have enough information to know what it was. I still don't, completely. But I know it's there. And," he said, "and I'm choosing to work with you on the basis of what you've shown me tonight rather than what you've concealed," she said. "Those are different, and you should understand that I know they are different. The concealed parts are not forgiven. They are filed. I will return to them when I have the resources to examine them properly." "That's fair," he said. "It's not fair," she said. "It's practical. Fair is a standard that requires complete information, and we have neither the time nor the information. Practical is what we have." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more durable than a smile. "I can work with practical," he said. "Good," she said. "Then let's go get a quorum." The next 2 hours were the most operationally demanding of a night that had contained no shortage of operational demand. She and Zevran came off the ridge on the valley's north face and met Fen in the tree line with horses that had not been there when they went up, which told her that Fen had retrieved them from somewhere during the garrison standoff with the quality of improvisation that belonged to people who ran parallel contingencies without being asked. The 5 riders from the way station met them at the valley's secondary exit, all present, none injured, moving with the compressed energy of people who had just spent 20 minutes being professionally obstructive and were now ready to do something more conclusive. She rode. They rode to Harev first because it was closer and because she needed the easier conversation to establish her cadence before the harder one. Governor Pelin of Harev received her in the main hall of his territory house, a practical man of 60 with the patient anger of someone who had filed 3 objections and received 3 denials, and had run out of institutional options and knew it. She placed the covenant document on his table and explained what it was and what she was offering with the clean directness of someone who had run out of political packaging and was simply delivering the material. He read the document. He looked at her. He said, "If this is real, it's real. Then every territorial claim Kaelor has made against Harev in the past decade is subject to review. Under the framework, yes. Independent review, chaired by a Vale heir." She held his gaze. "That's me." He looked at the pendant she wore openly now, no longer beneath the collar. She had taken it out when she descended the ridge, had let it sit against her chest in the morning light, had decided that the time for concealment was comprehensively finished, and anything worth doing from this point needed to be done in the open. "When?" he said. "The invocation is already recorded," she said. "The arbitration convenes when I have sufficient seat holders confirmed. I need your formal participation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he called his record keeper and dictated a formal statement of participation and signed it. She thanked him, which was not a performance. She was genuinely grateful, which she recognized as a different feeling from the professional satisfaction of a successful negotiation. It was the feeling of someone who had asked for something real and received it, and the distinction mattered. Solmain was harder. Governor Vassal was 40 and careful with it. The careful of someone who had watched political situations collapse around competent people and had drawn the conclusion that competence was insufficient and restraint was the more durable survival mechanism. He listened to her with his hands folded and his face professionally neutral, and when she finished, he said, "Morvain has financial accommodation arrangements that could be destabilized by territorial review." "Yes," she said. "The Emperor is here," Vassal said. He looked at Zevran. "Yes," she said again. "And he is endorsing this arbitration. He is endorsing equal territorial standing in the review process," she said. Morvain's claims go before the framework the same as anyone else's. I make no commitments on outcome. Vassal looked at Zevran. The accommodations, Vassal said. Zevran looked at him without expression. Will be honored regardless of the arbitration's outcomes, he said. They are financial instruments, not territorial ones. They don't change. Vassal unfolded his hands. He looked at the covenant document. He said, I've been waiting for something that didn't require me to choose between two empires for 12 years. This doesn't require you to choose, she said. It requires you to participate in a framework that exists specifically so that choosing isn't the only available mechanism. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he signed. She had her quorum. She stood outside Vassal's territory house in the full morning light, with the 6 participation documents in her hand, and the sun doing its indifferent work overhead, and the sound of Zevran behind her giving quiet instructions to Fen about communication routes. And she felt the weight of the documents in a way that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but was something that lived between them. A recognition, blunt and exhausted and real, that the things she had been told she was had turned out to be true, and that true things were frequently heavier than the lies that had been sitting in their place. The Confederation courier system moved fast enough that by midday, the formal arbitration notice had reached Liel at the Passage, the Kaler Palace, and the 3 contested territory governors simultaneously. She had designed the distribution deliberately, simultaneous so that nobody received it with preparation time and everyone had to react to the same information at the same moment. Draven received it in his council chamber. She knew this because the palace response came in 90 minutes, which was the time it took Draven to read something, recognize it was not what he expected, summon Mael, and discover that Mael was not in his usual place in the council chamber, had not been in his usual place since early morning, and was not, upon further investigation, available at any of his documented locations. Mael had moved. She had anticipated this. The moment the legitimacy challenge's underlying strategy was exposed, and she had ensured it was exposed through the Confederation courier system with enough documentation that any competent legal reader could reconstruct it in under an hour. Mael would understand that his position inside Kalor's court was finished. A man who had spent 23 years building political proximity would not wait to be removed from it. He would simply cease to be present. She did not know where he had gone. She suspected he had multiple exit routes prepared with the same care he had applied to everything else. She found she could not sustain the energy to pursue it. Mael had built a 40-year architecture, and she had walked through it and survived, and the arbitration was convened and the covenant was active, and every territorial claim in the Eastern Corridor was now subject to a framework that neither empire controlled. The structure of what he had built had served the purpose, even if the mechanism had not operated as he'd planned. He had wanted a piece on a board. He had gotten a chair who had read the board and decided to redesign it. She could be angry about that, or she could use what he had inadvertently given her. She chose the second option, not forgiveness, not absolution. The practical decision of a woman who understood that sustained anger toward an absent target was energy borrowed against future capacity with poor return on investment. Late afternoon found her at a table in the Confederation way station. Different room, different lamp, same cold, with Zevran across from her and 6 documents between them and the long work of actually building the arbitration framework's operational structure beginning to reveal its scope. The work was considerable. It was also, and she noted this with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected to find something they had been looking for in a location this unexpected, genuinely interesting. She had spent 3 years applying her capabilities to Draven's strategic problems. She had been good at it, but there had always been a quality to that work of running in a space slightly too small, of having to constrain her conclusions to fit the predetermined direction Draven had already chosen, of filing the analysis that went further and keeping it to herself because the further analysis was not what was wanted. Here she was building something from the actual ground, not advising, not refining someone else's direction. Building, with her own hands and her own understanding, a structure that would outlast the current political moment in ways she could actually trace from intention to architecture. Zevran worked across from her with the focused efficiency of a man who had understood since before she said it that this was going to require genuine effort, not positioning. He was good at operational detail in the way that people who had built empires rather than inherited them were good at operational detail. He had never had the luxury of delegating the foundation work entirely because the foundation had been his work. They disagreed twice in the first hour. Both times she held her position, and both times he recalibrated, and both times the resulting framework was more durable for the disagreement than it would have been for easy consensus. She recognized this quality of productive disagreement, had seen it rarely, in the best council sessions when the room contained enough genuine expertise and enough safety to surface real contention. And she recognized that it required two specific things from both parties: enough respect to take the other's position seriously, and enough self-assurance to defend their own. She was not surprised that Zevran had both. She was mildly surprised that she did. But there it was. Evening arrived gradually, which was how evenings arrived in the north. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the patient accumulation of darkness that happens when the sun takes its time, removing itself from a day. The formal arbitration notice had produced by evening responses from all 6 geographic seat holders confirming participation. The framework was active. The first hearing was scheduled for the coming month in neutral territory, a confederation hall in the Velhari Passage, which Soralia had selected specifically and with the particular satisfaction of choosing to hold the proceeding in the corridor that had been closed with a forged seal as the initial mechanism of tonight's entire chain of events. She selected it and then thought about whether the satisfaction was petty. She concluded it was slightly petty and entirely justified and kept the selection. Draven's formal response came at dusk. Not a legal challenge, not a military directive. A letter, in his hand, unmediated by counsel or minister. She read it alone in the small room. He did not apologize in the letter. She had not expected him to. The specific form of acknowledgement he was capable of was not apology. It was recognition, which was a different and in some ways more durable thing because it required actually seeing what had occurred rather than performing contrition about it. He wrote that he understood the framework was active and Kaylor would participate in the territorial review. He wrote that the legitimacy challenge was being formally withdrawn. He wrote, in language that was compressed and careful in the way of a man who chose each word with the awareness that they would be recorded, that he recognized his conduct had produced consequences he had not fully modeled. That was as close to an accounting as he was going to provide. She thought about whether it was enough. She thought about whether it needed to be enough, or whether its sufficiency was a question that belonged to her rather than to him, whether she was waiting for his accounting to reach some threshold that would permit her to close the ledger, or whether the ledger closed on her terms, regardless of what he offered. She set the letter down. She thought about what she had walked away from on the dais. She thought about what she had walked toward. She thought about what survival actually required of a person. Not the physical version, not simply continuing to breathe and move, but the version that required you to remain recognizably yourself through the process of becoming someone the circumstances demanded you become. The tension between those two things was where character actually lived. Not in the easy moments when being yourself cost nothing. In the moments when the cost of remaining yourself was everything you had. She had paid that cost tonight. She was still paying it. She suspected she would be paying it for a long time. But she was paying it as herself. As Soralia Vial, 7th seat of an active arbitration framework, heir to a house that had been erased and had declined to remain erased, rather than as the person she might have become if she had stepped toward Draven on the dais instead of away from him. And that difference was everything. She walked outside. The evening was cold with the particular intensity of northern nights, and the stars were the brilliant, indifferent variety she had looked at from the passage hours ago. The way station had settled into its evening operations, traders who had been held at the closed passage moving now that the closure was lifted, their relief palpable in the increased noise and activity of commerce recommencing. Commerce was its own kind of resilience. She had always found that quietly reassuring about the world's tendency to resume. Zevran was standing at the way station's outer edge, facing north. She walked to where he stood and stopped beside him, not touching, looking at the same horizon he was looking at. The hearing preparation is going to take 3 weeks minimum, she said. Yes. The contested territory positions are going to require individual preliminary sessions. Yes. I'm going to need independent legal counsel, not confederation aligned, not either empires. There are practitioners in the Eastern Independent Territories, he said. I can provide a list. I'll need to vet it myself. I'd expect nothing different. She looked at the northern horizon. Somewhere up there, past the black pine and the mountain ridges, and the cold that got colder as it went, was Zevran's empire. The one built by conquest rather than inheritance. The one that feared him for victories won without apology. She had never been north of the Velhari corridor. She had read the surveys. She thought about what she had told the man in the passage. She was not leaving with Zevran because he rescued her. She was leaving because Draven forced her to learn the cost of remaining. Both of those things were still true. But there was a third thing now that had not been true when she said it. She had not had language for it then. She was building the language now, slowly, from the particular quality of the night and the work and the disagreements and the one moment on the ridge where he had removed the strategic frame and stood in what was underneath it. She was not leaving behind a life that hadn't been built yet and moving toward a life she hadn't decided on yet because she had been forced to or managed into it, or because the alternative was worse. She was moving because this was the direction that contained the work she was actually capable of, the arbitration, the territories, the framework that had been waiting 70 years for someone to sit in the seventh seat and run it without asking permission. She was moving toward it because it was hers. That was different from anything she had ever moved toward before. The Wren watershed, she said. Yes. Morvaine's claim is 12 years old, Kaelor's is 20. The original settlement was made under duress during the Eastern Expansion conflict. Yes. I'm going to need the original settlement documentation, she said. The actual documents, not the summaries. I'll have them couriered. And the Kaelor Pass, the topographic surveys from the independent cartographer, not the imperial ones. Imperial surveys in contested territories have a tendency to show the territory in the most favorable configuration for the surveying empire. He looked at her. That's accurate, he said. It's also the kind of thing that a competent hearing chair accounts for, she said. I want the independent data. He studied her face in the evening light. She let him look. You're going to run the most thorough arbitration this framework has ever seen, he said. This framework has never been convened before, she said. So that's a low bar, but yes. Even on the Morvain claims, especially on the Morvan claims, she said, because if the process isn't genuinely equal, the outcomes aren't legitimate. And if the outcomes aren't legitimate, the framework collapses, and we do this again in 20 years with someone else in the seventh seat and two different empires with the same territorial problems. He was quiet for a moment. And if the process is genuinely equal and Morvain's claims don't hold up, then Morvain's claims don't hold up, she said. You asked for the hearing. I'm giving you the hearing. What the hearing produces is the hearing's business. He held her gaze. Something passed across his face that was more complicated than any expression she had yet catalogued from him. Not strategic, not assessed, something that lived in the territory of a man confronting the possibility that the thing he had maneuvered toward was more real than he had entirely planned for. She recognized the expression. She had worn it herself at intervals throughout the night. All right, he said. 2 words. Complete and final and specific in the way of someone making a genuine commitment rather than a strategic one. She looked north. The stars were very bright. The cold was the clean northern variety, honest in its intensity, not pretending to be anything other than cold. She thought about her mother wearing the pendant under her collar for 20 years. She thought about the specific courage that required, not the dramatic kind, not the public kind, but the sustained daily courage of carrying something important in silence while the world arranged itself around a lie, of maintaining the preservation of something that could not yet be used but needed to exist until it could. Her mother had been the keeper. She was the one it had been kept for. She reached up and closed her hand around the pendant briefly, not lifting it, just holding it against her sternum, feeling its weight, the weight of 70 years in a house that had refused to die, and a woman who had done the work of an entire generation without witnessing its conclusion. She released it. She put her hand down. She looked at the northern road, and she began to walk toward it, toward the work that was actually hers, the framework that had been waiting, the seventh seat of a thing that 2 empires had spent 70 years being afraid of, not away from what she had lost, toward what she had always been. Behind her, the way station moved in its evening commerce, and beside her, Zevran matched her pace without being asked, and overhead, the stars that had been burning their cold light over every version of this night, over the Grand Hall, and the palace steps, and the passage, and the ridge, and the valley, and every calculation and every decision and every moment of clarity that had arrived through the specific mechanism of having nothing left to lose, those stars continued their indifferent work. They always did. The crowns that broke people, the thrones that revealed them, the bonds that burned to smoke, all of it moved beneath those stars with the brief urgency of things that believed their moment was everything. And the stars kept burning anyway. And the road kept going north. And on it walked a woman who had been discarded and broken open and maneuvered and stripped and rebuilt, who had paid the full cost of surviving a night designed to be survived on someone else's terms, and who had arrived on the other side of all of it at the only thing worth arriving at, herself, undiminished, sovereign,